Gideon Voss didn't knock. That was the first thing Mara Whitlock noticed, not the cold air that rushed through her front door, not the two men standing behind him with their hands near their belts, not even the folded papers he slapped down on her kitchen table hard enough to rattle the tin cups. He didn't knock. He just walked into her house like he already owned it. "You've had enough time to grieve," he said, pulling off one glove finger by finger, slow and deliberate, like a man who had nowhere to be and all the power in the world to prove it. "Sign those papers tonight, Mrs. Whitlock, or I'll make sure every bank between here and Cheyenne knows you're 3 months behind on your land note." Mara looked at the papers. Then she looked at her son Caleb, 11 years old, standing in the doorway with his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle working in his cheek. He'd heard everything. Of course he had. She thought about her husband. She thought about the hands that had built this house, plank by plank, in the summer heat. She thought about the fact that she had a newborn sleeping in the back room and $7 to her name. Then she folded her hands on the table, looked Gideon Voss directly in the eye, and said nothing. If you've ever had someone try to take something that was yours, something you bled for, something you built, something you refused to let go of, even when every reasonable voice told you to quit, then you already understand what this story is really about. Before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell, because every week we bring you stories like this one. Stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary courage exactly when they had nothing left to lose. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to Wyoming. The blizzard came in from the northwest, the way the worst ones always did, without much warning and without any mercy. By midday, the sky had turned the color of old pewter, low and flat, and pressing down on the land like a lid being forced shut. By 2 in the afternoon, you couldn't see 30 feet in any direction. The wind didn't howl the way people in novels describe wind howling. It was more of a steady, indifferent roar, the kind of sound that doesn't care whether you're listening. Mara Whitlock had been on the road for 3 hours when the axle broke. She heard it before she felt it, a crack that came up through the wagon boards and into her teeth, and then the whole left side dropped and dragged, and she pulled the reins hard, and the horse screamed, and the children were suddenly grabbing for anything solid. "Mama," Toby's voice high and terrified. "I've got her," Caleb said immediately, grabbing for the baby before Mara even registered that Nell had slid. Caleb, 11 years old, already sounding like a man who'd made himself responsible for things that were too heavy for him. Mara had noticed that in him ever since his father died. A boy trying to fill a space he couldn't possibly fill, not because he wasn't good enough, but because no child should ever have to try. She climbed down from the wagon and looked at the axle. The left wheel had sheared clean off at the housing. Not cracked. Gone. Even if she'd had the tools to fix it, which she didn't, the temperature was dropping so fast. Her breath was going solid in the air before it cleared her face. She had a few blankets in the wagon bed, some cornmeal, half a tin of dried beans, enough food for maybe 2 meals if she stretched it, and 2 young boys and a 6-week-old baby to keep alive. She stood in the snow and thought very hard for exactly 10 seconds. Most of its windows were dark. Then she stopped thinking about everything she didn't have and started thinking about what she did. The Rourke property was maybe 2 miles east. She knew that because her husband Jonas had told her once, back when they first settled the valley, that if she was ever caught out on the Ridge Road in bad weather, the Rourke place was the only shelter for miles in that direction. He'd said it in the casual way husbands say things they don't think will ever matter. She'd filed it away like she filed away most practical things, Jonas said. "Just in case, Caleb." She turned back to the wagon. "I need you to hold Nell inside your coat. Keep her against your chest. Don't let her face the wind." Caleb was already doing it before she finished the sentence. Toby was staring at the broken wheel with an expression of genuine scientific interest that would have been funny under any other circumstances. "Is it supposed to do that?" he asked. "No," Mara said. "Come on." She didn't tell them how far it was. She didn't tell them what would happen if the Rourke place turned out to be empty, or if the man inside refused to open the door to strangers in a blizzard, which she had no particular reason to believe he wouldn't. She'd heard things about Silas Rourke, the same as everyone in Coldwater Ridge had heard things that he'd been a lawman once, that something had happened to his partner, that he lived alone, and intended to keep it that way. She picked up Toby and carried him because his boots weren't thick enough and his feet were already going numb. She was not a small woman, but Toby was 7 years old and solid, and by the time they'd gone half a mile, she could feel her arms shaking. She didn't put him down. She kept walking. Caleb walked beside her without a word, holding Nell against his chest, hunched over the baby like a human wall between her and the wind. Mara thought about Jonas. Not in the sentimental way people describe thinking about someone they've lost a warm glow, a comforting presence. It wasn't like that. It was more like a bruise she kept pressing on without meaning to. Specific shape of his hands. The way he laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them. The fact that he would never know this baby girl he'd been so certain was going to have his mother's eyes. She pressed it, felt the ache, kept walking. The Rourke property appeared through the snow as a smear of yellow light in the gray. One window, a lamp burning inside. It was the most beautiful thing Mara Whitlock had ever seen in her life. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder, with the side of her fist. She heard boots on a wooden floor. A long pause. Then a voice, low, rough, the voice of a man who didn't use it much. Who's there? My name is Mara Whitlock. My wagon axle broke on the ridge road. I have 3 children with me, and one of them is 6 weeks old, and I need to come inside. Another pause, longer than she'd have liked. Please, she added, and she hated herself a little for it, but not enough to take it back. The door opened. Silas Rourke was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure exactly what she had expected, something wilder, maybe, more obviously damaged. He was just a man, mid-40s, with a face that had been weathered past the point where you could guess at what it might have looked like once. He was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled down and a suspicious expression that he was clearly trying to keep neutral and mostly failing at. He looked at Caleb, then at Toby, still on Mara's hip, face buried in her neck. Then at the lump inside Caleb's coat, where Nell was making a sound that was somewhere between a complaint and a question. Something shifted in Silas Rourke's face. It wasn't warmth exactly. It was more like something that had been braced for a long time, letting go by the smallest possible amount. He stepped back. Come in. The inside of the house was exactly what she'd have guessed from the outside functional, sparse, nothing in it that didn't serve an obvious purpose. One chair pulled up to the stove, one plate drying on a cloth beside the basin. 8 years of a man who had organized his life around the fact that he was the only person who had to live in it. Sit, he said, nodding at the chair. There's another one in the back room. I'll get it. He disappeared. Mara sat down and put Toby on his feet and started pulling off his boots to check his toes. They were pale but not white. Good, he'd be fine. Caleb carefully extracted Nell from his coat. The baby had fallen asleep somewhere during the last half mile, which Mara took as evidence that her daughter had inherited her father's unnerving ability to sleep through almost anything. She held Nell against her chest and felt the small warmth of her and breathed. Silas came back with a wooden chair and set it down across from the first one. He looked at the baby. He looked at Mara's face, which she knew was not presenting her best self, at the moment eyes red from the wind, or maybe from something else. She wasn't entirely sure. How long you been walking, he asked. Maybe 40 minutes. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word and went to the stove and started building the fire up higher. He moved like a man who'd spent decades doing practical things in practical silence and had come to prefer it that way. There's food, he said. It's not much. Beans and salt pork. I can add water to it. That's more than enough, Mara said. Thank you. He nodded once and got to work. Toby had been sitting still for approximately the maximum amount of time Toby was capable of sitting still, which was about 90 seconds. He slid off his chair and went and stood next to Silas and watched him with the unblinking intensity only a 7-year-old can sustain. Are you a cowboy? Toby asked. Silas didn't look up. Rancher. Is that different? Yes. How? Silas considered this with the gravity it apparently deserved. Cowboys work cattle. Ranchers own them. Do you have a lot of cows? Enough. Do any of them have names? Silas's jaw moved slightly. It might have been the beginning of a smile or just a muscle twitch. Hard to tell. No, I could name them, Toby offered generously. I'm good at names. I'll keep that in mind, Silas said, in a tone that somehow communicated that he would not be keeping that in mind. Mara watched this exchange and felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled tight since October, since Morrison she'd woken up, and Jonas was cold beside her, and she'd understood with a horrible clarity that the life she'd been building was now something she would have to rebuild alone. She didn't trust it, that loosening. She'd learned too recently how quickly things could shift, but she let herself feel it anyway, just for a moment. The warmth of a fire that was not hers. A man cooking food he hadn't planned to share. Her youngest son already treating a stranger like a neighbor. Caleb had not spoken once. He sat in the second chair with his arms folded, watching Silas with the careful eyes of a boy who had decided that the world owed him nothing, and that any kindness offered for free had to have a price he just hadn't found yet. Mara recognized that expression. It was the expression Jonas sometimes wore when he was scared, but refusing to admit it. She wondered when Caleb had learned it. She wondered if she'd taught it to him without meaning to. Silas set bowls on the small table. 3 bowls, which meant he wasn't eating, which Mara noticed and filed away as a thing to address when she had more energy. He pulled a stool close to the table for Toby and didn't make a production of it, just moved things around until everyone had a place, practical as arranging fence posts. "Sit," he said again, to Caleb this time. Caleb sat. He looked at the bowl. He looked at Silas. "What do you want for this?" he asked. Question landed in the room with a weight that surprised Mara. She opened her mouth to say something Caleb stopped, but Silas spoke first. He looked at the boy for a long moment, not annoyed, not insulted. Something more like a man recognizing a question he'd asked himself once and understood the weight of. "Nothing," Silas said. Caleb's eyes didn't move. "Everybody wants something." "Then I want you to eat before it gets cold," Silas said. "That's all." He turned back to the stove. Caleb stared at his back for 3 full seconds. Then he picked up his spoon. It wasn't trust, but it was the beginning of something, and beginnings are usually small. Outside, the blizzard was building toward its worst. The window glass was sheeted white. The wind was finding every gap in the siding and announcing itself in thin, cold notes. The lamp on the table made a circle of light that kept the dark at the edges of the room. Most of its windows were dark. Silas moved around the perimeter of that circle without entering it, as if he lived out there in the margins by habit and didn't entirely know how to come back to the middle. After supper, which Toby ate with the single-minded dedication of a child who had recently discovered how hungry he was, Silas quietly offered the back bedroom to Mara and the children. She started to protest. He held up one hand. "I'll be fine by the stove," he said. There was no room in his voice for argument. Not rude, just final, the way a man speaks when he's made up his mind and isn't interested in performing the debate. She took the bedroom. She got the children settled, Nell in the center of the bed with Caleb and Toby bracketing her like bookends, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and listened to them breathe. And Toby went out fast, the way children do when they've burned through everything they had. Caleb lay on his back, staring at the ceiling for a long time, before his eyes finally closed, jaw still set even in sleep. Mara went back to the main room. Silas was in his chair beside the stove. He'd pulled it back slightly to make room for her, she realized. There was a second chair, positioned close enough to the warmth that she'd have to be blind not to notice the intention. She sat down. For a while, neither of them said anything. The fire popped and settled. Outside, something a loose board or a shutter banged rhythmically in the wind. "I knew Jonas Whitlock," Silas said finally, not looking at her. Looking at the stove, Mara felt that like a hand pressing on the bruise. "Did you? Not well. Saw him at the feed store a few times." Silas stopped. Started again. He seemed like a steady man. "He was," Mara said. "He was the steadiest man I ever knew." Another silence. Not uncomfortable, exactly. The kind of silence that forms between people who both understand loss and have learned not to make noise around it, just to fill space. "What happened?" Silas asked. She got the impression he didn't ask questions much, that asking this one cost him something. "Heart," Mara said. "October. He was in the barn, and I thought he was just taking a long time. And then I went out, and she stopped." She had told this story before, to the preacher, to the neighbors, who'd come with food. Most of its windows were dark. Each time she'd found a way to tell it that kept her slightly outside of it, like describing something that happened to someone she knew. He was just gone. She finished. He was 43 years old. Silas's hands were clasped between his knees. He didn't say sorry or "I know how it feels" or any of the things people said. He just sat with it, with the weight of what she'd told him, and didn't pretend that weight wasn't there. Nell was 5 weeks early, Mara said. She hadn't planned to keep talking. Somehow she was. Jonas never got to hold her. She came the week after. Silas closed his eyes for a moment, just briefly, then opened them again. "I'm sorry," he said. And the way he said it, flat and specific, without embellishment, made it the most honest version of those 2 words she'd heard since October. "So am I," she said. They sat in the firelight. They sat in the firelight while the storm did everything it could against the walls of the house. And the house old and weathered and thoroughly repaired and repaired again by a man who'd had 8 years and nothing but time held. Mara realized something, sitting there. She'd been so focused on surviving, on getting through each day with enough of herself intact to show up for the children the next morning, that she hadn't let herself simply sit in a warm room with another human being in a long time. She hadn't let herself be still. It was uncomfortable. Not the silence, the stillness, the awareness that she didn't have to move or manage or hold anything together for 5 consecutive minutes. She wasn't sure she trusted it. She was pretty sure she needed it. Silas got up once during the night to add wood to the stove. She heard him do it, half asleep in the chair she'd eventually drifted off in, and she heard him check the windows and try the door against the wind, and then settle back into his chair. In the morning, when she woke with a stiff neck and the particular awareness that comes from sleeping somewhere unfamiliar, she found a cup of coffee on the stool beside her, still warm. She looked at Silas, across the room with his back to her, starting something at the stove for breakfast. She thought about Jonas, who had done that exact thing, left coffee, where she'd find it without making her ask every single morning for 11 years. She looked down at the cup. She pressed the brews. Then she drank the coffee. Outside, the blizzard was finally easing. The worst had passed in the night. But there was enough snow on the ground now, and enough ice on the roads, that leaving today was not a reasonable option. Maybe not tomorrow either. She was stranded in a stranger's house with 3 children and a broken wagon, dependent on a man she didn't know, in a situation she would not have chosen and could not control. And somehow, this was the part that surprised her. The thing she felt most strongly was not fear. It was something she hadn't felt in long enough that it took her a moment to recognize it. It felt like something might be all right. She held on to that with both hands, knowing from experience how fast things could shift. But she held it. Caleb appeared in the bedroom doorway, looked at Silas, looked at his mother. His eyes were still cautious, but he was wearing his boots already, which meant some part of him had already decided to see what this day was going to bring. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. He was talking to Silas. Silas turned from the stove, looked at him, nodded once. "Chickens need water," he said. "I'll show you where." Caleb followed him out. Toby appeared 2 minutes later, hair catastrophic, looking deeply pleased with everything, and announced that he had names for at least 4 of the cows, if anyone was interested. Mara laughed. The sound surprised her. It surprised Toby too. He blinked at her, then grinned the wide, uncomplicated grin of a child who doesn't know yet how rare it is to make your mother laugh on a morning like this one. She held on to that too. The chickens did not care that it was cold. That was the first thing Caleb learned about Silas Rourke's operation. The animals ran on their own schedule and expected the humans to accommodate it, not the other way around. The henhouse was 30 yards from the back door, and by the time Caleb had crossed that distance behind Silas was stinging and his fingers, already going stiff, is inside his gloves. Silas didn't rush. He moved through the cold the way a man moves through his own living room, not comfortable, exactly, but entirely unsurprised by it. He pulled the henhouse latch with one hand, ducked through the low door, and had the water trough unfrozen and refilled before Caleb had fully registered what tools were being used. "You do this every morning?" Caleb asked. "Every morning," Silas said, "even when it's like this." Silas looked at him, "Especially when it's like this. They don't eat less because the weather's bad." Caleb considered this. He'd been helping with the family's small stock back home, but their situation was different. 2 horses, some laying hens, a milk cow named Bess that his father had acquired in trade 2 springs ago. What Silas had was an actual operation, with a logic to it, a sequence of tasks that connected to each other in ways Caleb could see once he started paying attention. "What else needs doing?" he asked. Silas glanced at him sideways. Something in the look wasn't suspicious anymore. Not exactly. More like a man recalibrating a measurement he'd already taken. You asking so you can help? Or so you can tell me you can do it yourself? The question was so precise that Caleb felt it like a finger pressed against something sore. He didn't answer for a moment. Both probably, he said finally. Silas made a sound that was almost not quite a laugh. Fair enough, he said. Come on. They spent 2 hours working through the morning chores together. Silas shut rather than told he'd do a thing once, and then stepped back and let Caleb try it. And if Caleb did it wrong, he'd correct, without making a production of the correction. Quiet repositioning of the hands, a word about angle or pressure. Nothing that required Caleb to feel stupid in order to learn. Caleb's father had taught him the same way. He noticed that and said nothing about it. Back inside, Toby had cornered Mara at the table and was explaining his naming system for the cattle, which appeared to involve a combination of physical characteristics and what he called the feeling you get when you look at them. Mara was listening with the patient expression of a woman who had long since accepted that Toby's interior world operated by its own rules, and that arguing with those rules was a waste of everyone's energy. Silas set 2 more plates on the table without being asked. Salt pork again, and cornbread this time, slightly lopsided in a way that suggested he'd made it himself, and wasn't particularly concerned about geometry. He put a smaller piece on a saucer near the fire where it could stay warm. For when Nell woke up and Mara needed a free hand, Mara noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. The storm outside was quieter than yesterday, but hadn't given up entirely. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind was still moving everything that had already fallen, sending it sideways across the fields in long white curtains that made distance impossible to judge. The ridge road would be buried. Even if the axle on the wagon had been intact, going anywhere today would have been a question of survival rather than travel. Silas told her this plainly after breakfast, while Toby was outside throwing snowballs at a fence post, and Caleb was in the barn double-checking something about the horse shoes that he'd noticed that morning and asked permission to look at. Road won't clear until tomorrow at the earliest, Silas said. Might be the day after. You're welcome here until it does. He said it the way he said most things, without the performance of generosity, without waiting for her to express gratitude. Just a fact being stated to a person who needed to know it. I'll work for it, Mara said. He looked at her. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She met his eyes steadily. I want to. I'm not good at sitting still, and I'm not good at owing people things I haven't earned. So tell me what needs doing inside, and I'll do it. A long pause. Then, can you sew? Yes. There's a saddlebag in the back room that needs a seam repaired. I've been putting it off because I'm not good at it, and I keep making it worse. Show me, she said. He showed her. She fixed the seam in 20 minutes, neatly and without conversation, Nell in a sling across her chest the whole time. Silas watched her work, and had the look of a man being educated about something he hadn't known he didn't know. Could have done that yourself, she said, handing it back. I know how to do it, he said. I don't know how to do it well. There's a difference, she agreed. Yes, he said. There is. That was more words than Silas Rourke had spoken to another adult in what felt like a very long time, and they both understood that without either one saying so. The afternoon passed the way afternoons and snowbazas pass slowly in real time and quickly in memory. Toby exhausted himself outside and came in for a nap he would never have accepted under normal circumstances. Nell woke up and was fed and held and passed to Caleb when Mara's arms needed a rest, and Caleb held his baby sister with the careful, slightly terrified concentration of a who understood the weight of something fragile. Silas watched all of this from the peripheral edges of the house. Not uninvolved, he kept the fire right. He found an extra blanket for Toby. He checked the horse and the chickens again, without anyone asking him to, but always just outside the center of things, in the habit of a man who had arranged his life around not being needed. What was becoming clear in the slow unfolding of the day was that the habit wasn't holding as well as usual. Mara caught him looking at Nell once, when the baby was on the blanket near the stove, making the specific noises of an infant, discovering that her own fists existed. His expression in that unguarded moment was something Mara had no name for not longing, not sadness, something older and less definable than either of those things. Like a man looking at a door he'd boarded up long ago and wondering what was still on the other side. She looked away before he noticed her watching. That evening, Caleb asked Silas about the knots. It started because there was a length of rope on the workbench near the back wall, and Caleb had been eyeing it since morning, and finally he picked it up and attempted something and made a mess of it, and Silas, without being asked, walked over and showed him the correct sequence. "What's that one called?" Caleb asked. "Bowline," Silas said. "Won't slip under load. Useful for securing anything you don't want to move." Caleb practiced it, got it wrong. Tried again. "You have to set it before you pull," Silas said. He didn't reach for the rope. He just set it and waited. Caleb set it, pulled. The knot held. He looked at it with an expression Mara recognized the specific satisfaction of understanding something mechanical, of having a thing work because you made it work, not because someone did it for you. Jonas had worn that expression every time he solved a problem that had been fighting him for days. "My father was going to teach me this," Caleb said. He didn't say it with particular emotion, just a statement offered to the air. Silas was quiet for a moment. "What happened?" he asked. He said it the same way he'd asked Mara last night, like a man who didn't waste questions and expected the same in return. Heart, Caleb said, the same word Mara had used. Inherited vocabulary for an inherited loss. "October, I know," Silas said. "Your mother told me." Caleb looked at him. "Then why'd you ask?" "Because I wanted to hear how you told it." Caleb turned back to the rope. He wound it around his hand once, twice, the way Silas had shown him, and then stopped. "He didn't finish teaching me a lot of things," he said. "I'm trying to learn them myself, but it's hard to know which things I'm doing right and which ones I'm just doing because I don't know better." Silas sat down on the workbench, not close, but within talking distance. "That's true for everybody," he said. "It doesn't feel like it's true for you," Caleb said. Silas looked at the boy for a long moment. There was something complicated moving behind his eyes, the kind of thing a man does when he's deciding how honest to be with someone he doesn't owe honesty to. "I've made enough bad decisions to fill a barn," he said finally. "I just made most of them a long time ago." Caleb absorbed this. Did they get better? "Some things got better. Some things I just got used to." He paused. "That's not the same." "No," Caleb said, "I know." He was 11 years old. He shouldn't have known. The fact that he did was the most heartbreaking thing about him. Mara was in the doorway. She'd come to call them to supper and had stopped because the conversation was the kind you don't interrupt without cost. She stood there and listened and understood something she hadn't fully grasped before about what the last 4 months had done to her oldest son. He wasn't just grieving. He was isolated in his grief. He'd decided that becoming a man meant handling it alone, that leaning on anyone was weakness, that the people around him needed protection rather than honesty. He'd built a very small, very sturdy room around himself and locked the door. Most of its windows were dark. He was talking to Silas Rourke through a crack in the wall, and Silas, without seeming to try, without seeming to understand exactly what he was doing, was not trying to break the door down. He was just sitting outside it, having a conversation, patient as weather. She went back to the stove and gave them another 10 minutes. Supper that night was the last of the salt roast pork and the rest of the cornbread and some dried apples Silas found in a tin at the back of a shelf. He apologized for not having more. Mara told him if he apologized again, she would take it personally, and something in her tone made Toby look up from his plate with wide, interested eyes, and Silas's mouth do the thing it did sometimes, where it started to form a smile and then thought better of it. "Who taught you to cook?" Toby asked Silas. "My," Silas said. "Did you burn things a lot at first?" "Still do." "Mama used to burn things when she was sad," Toby said helpfully. "She burned 2 whole pots of oatmeal after Papa died." "Toby," Mara said. "What? It's true, I know it's true. We don't have to share everything that's true." Toby considered this philosophical position and appeared to disagree with it on principle, but was wise enough not to say so directly. He turned back to Silas. "Do you get sad?" he asked. "Sometimes," Silas said. He didn't elaborate, and didn't seem embarrassed by the question which Toby apparently found sufficient. "Me too," Toby said. "I miss Papa, but I also think about him a lot during the day, like when I see something he would have thought was interesting. So it feels like he's still kind of here." He put a piece of apple in his mouth. "Is that weird?" Silas looked at the boy for a moment with an expression that was not remotely paternal, but was something adjacent to it, the look of a man in the presence of uncomplicated honesty and not quite sure what to do with it. No, he said. That's not weird. Good, Toby said, and went back to his apple. Caleb was watching Silas again, that measuring, cautious watch that hadn't entirely softened. But there was something in it now that hadn't been there this morning. Something that was less like suspicion and more like the early stages of a question he didn't know how to ask yet. After supper, while Mara was getting the children settled, Silas went to the window and looked out at the dark. The wind had dropped. The sky was clear now, stars hard and bright in the cold, and by morning the temperature would have dropped another 10 degrees at least, and then in the illogical way of Wyoming winters, it would start to warm. He'd lived alone long enough to know exactly what tomorrow's weather would bring. He'd lived alone long enough to have a kind of sixth sense for the temperature and the road conditions, and the particular quality of silence that meant the worst had passed. He'd also lived alone long enough to know what a full house sounded like. And he'd forgotten it until tonight. It was the specific sound of other people's breathing in a house. The particular weight of small bodies moving from room to room, the sound of Toby's voice, asking something from behind a closed door, the low murmur of Mara's voice answering. Nell making small noises from the center of the bed. He hadn't realized until tonight how completely silent this place had been. Not peaceful, just silent. There's a difference, and he'd been telling himself for 8 years that he didn't know the difference, and now in the worst possible way, at the worst possible time he was remembering it. He stood at the window for a long time. Mara came out of the back room and found him there. She didn't say anything immediately. She went to the stove and checked on the fire and then stood with her back to it, warming her hands and looked at his back. It'll be clear tomorrow, he said. I know, she said. You'll want us gone. He turned from the window. I didn't say that. No, but you're standing at the window like a man counting down to something. He looked at her. She had a directness that he hadn't encountered in a long time. Not rudeness, Jonas Whitlock had apparently had the sense to marry a woman who spoke plainly, and she'd apparently extended him the same courtesy. The road will be passable by midday, he said. I'll look at the wagon axle in the morning. I have spare parts, it's fixable. She nodded. Thank you. You don't need to keep saying that. I know I don't, she said, the same way she'd said it about the work. I want to. There was a beat of silence. Outside, the wind had given up entirely, and the night was perfectly still in the way that only happens after a major storm, like the world itself had exhausted something. How bad is it? Silas asked. The land situation. She looked at him. What land situation? You have a homestead to get back to. Alone. 3 children, one of them a newborn. It's February in Wyoming. He said it without judgment, just the list of facts. I'm asking what you're going back to. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down in the chair by the stove because it felt easier to say things sitting down. We have about 40 acres, she said. Jonas built the house and the barn himself mostly. We have 2 horses, the milk cow, some chickens. There's enough pasture for a small herd if we ever got to that point. She paused. There's a man named Gideon Voss who's been trying to buy the north acreage since before Jonas died. He thinks a railroad might come through somewhere up there. Silas's expression changed, just slightly. Something sharpening. What kind of buy, he asked. The first 2 times he asked, it was a real offer. Lowball, but real. After Jonas died, it stopped being an offer. She looked at the fire. His man came around in November with papers. Said we had a debt on the land note I wasn't aware of. Jonas handled the finances, and I went through every paper he ever kept, and I couldn't find anything that matched what Voss's man was describing. He was testing you, Silas said, seeing if you'd panic. That's what I figured. She looked up at him. So I wrote a letter to the land office in Cheyenne asking for copies of all records on the Whitlock parcel. Haven't gotten an answer yet. Silas was very still for a moment. When did you send that letter? December. It's been 2 months. I know. They looked at each other. That's just a long time for a land record request, Silas said. Yes, Mara said. It is. She said it calmly, the way she said most things that were actually scaring her, and Silas understood something about her then, that she was not unafraid. She was just practiced at not letting fear make her decisions. There's a kind of strength in that which is entirely different from bravery, which is an easier thing because it happens fast. What Mara Whitlock had was the harder variety. The kind that has to be maintained every single morning. Voss came to the house, she said. Last month. Didn't knock. She paused on that detail. Brought papers I didn't recognize. Said if I signed them, he'd take over the note and I'd be free of the debt. I asked him to leave the papers so I could read them. He said they needed to be signed that night or the offer expired. Did you sign? No. What did he left? She said, but one of his men went through the barn before they rode out. I found things moved, feed bags shifted, some tack that had been gone through. She pressed her lips together. He was looking for something. Silas leaned against the wall across from her. His arms were crossed, and his expression was the specific controlled blankness of a man who is very angry and has extensive practice keeping it on a leash. He was looking for your land papers, to see what you actually had. That's what I think, Mara. He said her name, and she noticed it was the first time he'd used it. He'd been careful, since yesterday, to not use it, which she'd attributed to reserve, but understood now might be something else. What did Jonas's papers say about the North Acreage? Free and clear, she said. Filed in 76. I have the original deed. Where is it? Hidden, she said, simply, like a woman who had not made the mistake of leaving something that valuable anywhere obvious. He nodded once, slowly. Good. Then, when you get home, don't show anyone those papers until you know exactly what Voss has filed against you. Not neighbors. Not the sheriff, nobody, until you understand what's in front of you. She looked at him. You know about this kind of thing. It wasn't a question. He'd answered too quickly, with the specificity of someone who wasn't guessing. He held her gaze for a moment. I used to, he said. A long time ago. She waited. He didn't offer more, and she had the sense correctly that pushing would close a door that had opened by about an inch and a half. She filed the information away instead, the way she filed everything carefully, in order for when she needed it. Get some sleep, he said. I'll start on the axle first thing. Stood. She was almost to the back room when he spoke again. The sheriff in Coldwater Ridge is Jonas Pike, he said. He's a decent man. If things with Voss get worse before they get better, he's worth talking to. Turned. You know him? I know him, Silas said. Flat. Final, not elaborating, she nodded. Good night, she said. Good night, he said, and turned back to the window. She lay in the dark for a long time, Nell warm beside her, Caleb's breathing slow and deep on the other side of the baby. Toby had thrown one arm over his face in his sleep, the way he always did, the way Jonas had always done. She thought about Gideon Voss and his papers, and the men who went through her barn. She thought about the letter she'd sent to Cheyenne 2 months ago that no one had answered. The Valdez were dark. She thought about a man who used to know things about land fraud and knew the local sheriff by name and had buried something 8 years ago that she still didn't have the full shape of. She thought about 40 acres and 2 boys and a baby girl and a milk cow named Bess and a deed that was free and clear and hidden where no one was going to find it. She thought, I am not going to lose that land. Not to weather. Not to grief. Not to a man who doesn't knock. She pressed the bruise once, out of habit. Felt the ache. Let it pass. Then she slept. Morning came in cold and blazing, the way mornings do after big storms the sky, an absolute, unreasonable blue, every surface encrusted in ice that threw the light in every direction, beautiful and sharp and completely indifferent to whether you appreciated it. Silas had been in the barn for an hour before anyone inside the house woke up. Caleb found him there when he came out to do the chickens, and without a word between them, they split the morning chores the same way they had yesterday, each one taking what needed doing and doing it. It was Caleb who noticed the axle parts laid out on the workbench. You already pulled the parts, he said. Last night, Silas said. After everyone was asleep, Caleb looked at the bench. Parts were clean, rust knocked off, organized in the sequence they'd need to be used. It was the work of maybe 40 minutes, done in the cold after midnight by a man who could have waited until morning. Why? Caleb asked. Silas picked up a wrench. Because I wanted you to be able to leave when the road cleared. He paused. Not because I want you gone. Because it should be your mother's choice when to go, not mine. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, you used to be a lawman. Silas looked at him. She didn't know that until last night. She told me this morning. Caleb watched him. She tells me things. She's been doing it more since Papa died. I think she figures I should know what's going on. He picked up a bolt, turned it over in his hands. Why'd you stop? That's a long story, Silas said. We've got until the road clears, Caleb said. Silas looked at him. The boy's eyes were steady and patient, in a way that 11-year-olds' eyes are not usually steady and patient. And Silas understood that Caleb Whitlock had aged somewhere in the last 4 months in a direction that couldn't be reversed, only built on. He put down the wrench. He leaned against the workbench. I had a partner, he said, named Gerald Hatch. Good man. Better than I was at most things, which I didn't appreciate the way I should have. He said it without self-pity, just a fact being recounted. We went after a man named Cutter who'd been moving stolen cattle through 3 counties. Should have waited for backup from the marshal's office. I thought we had enough. He paused. We didn't. Caleb waited. Gerald died in the doorway of a barn in Laramie County on a Tuesday afternoon, Silas said, and I walked out. That's not your fault, Caleb said immediately. Silas looked at him. Maybe not entirely. But I made the call. I decided we had enough when we didn't, and Gerald had a wife and a daughter in Casper who are living a different life now because of that decision. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Did you go back to being a lawman after? No. Because you were afraid to? The question was direct enough to be slightly rude. Caleb seemed to know this and didn't particularly care. Silas found he didn't particularly mind. Partly, he said. Partly because I figured anyone who depended on me was taking a risk they didn't deserve to take. Caleb looked at the barn door, then back at Silas. That's the same thing as afraid, he said, just dressed up differently. Silas looked at the boy for a long time. You're 11 years old, he said. I know, Caleb said. I'm right, though, aren't I? It wasn't quite a question. Silas picked up the wrench again and turned to the axle housing. Help me with this, he said. I'll show you how it goes together. They worked on the wagon for 2 hours. Silas showed, and Caleb learned, and neither of them returned to the conversation about Gerald Hatch or fear dressed up as something else, but it sat in the barn with them, quiet and present, and neither of them pretended it didn't. Inside, Mara had found Silas's broom and his cleaning cloth, and had done something to the main room that Silas would later be unable to identify precisely, but that made it look different, not transformed. Just attended to, in the way that a space looks when someone in it has decided it matters. She'd rearranged nothing. She'd just cleaned what was there, and somehow that was more disorienting than if she'd moved the furniture. Toby had helped, mostly by sweeping a pile of dust from one side of the room to the other, while narrating what he was doing in real time. When Silas and Caleb came in for midday meal, Silas stopped in the doorway and looked at his house. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, Mara said, for the 3rd time, with exactly the same tone. Silas sat down. Toby presented him with a piece of paper on which he had drawn what appeared to be a map, labeled in large, uneven letters. This is your property, Toby announced. I put names on where all the animals are. The cows are in the east pasture, so I called that section Big Cow Place, but that's just temporary until I think of something better. Silas looked at the map for a long time. His expression was genuinely unreadable. You spelled temporary correctly, he said finally. Toby looked delighted. I know. Mama taught me. Silas folded the map and put it in his shirt pocket. Toby's face broke into the kind of that makes adults feel like they've done something right by accident. Caleb watched this, and something in his face shifted. Not much. But Mara, who had been watching Caleb watch Silas for 2 days, saw it the very first crack in the deliberate composure her son had been wearing since October, the first sign that something in him considering was a possibility that a person could be trusted without it being a trap. She didn't point it out. She didn't say a word. She just put the food on the table and called them in. The road cleared by 2 o'clock. Silas loaded what he'd fixed on the wagon. The axle was solid now, cleaner than the original had been, with new hardware he'd have to replace in his parts supply later. He checked the horse's shoes, the harness, the weight distribution in the wagon bed. He did all of this without commentary, and Mara let him do it, because she could tell it was the way he showed things instead of saying them. The children were loaded. Toby was still telling a fence post goodbye. Caleb was up on the seat, and he looked down at Silas with the specific expression of a boy who has something to say and hasn't decided whether to say it. He said it. Will you come see how we fix the barn door? He asked. It's been sticking since November, and I can't figure out what's wrong with it. Silas looked up at him. Then he looked at Mara. She was watching him, not with expectation exactly, but with an openness that he hadn't seen directed at him in a very long time. She wasn't asking, she wasn't pushing. She was simply present in the way she'd been present for 2 days, direct and warm and entirely unimpressed by his silence and entirely unwilling to be frightened off by it. "I'll come by tomorrow," Silas said, to Caleb, but he held Mara's gaze when he said it. Toby cheered from the back of the wagon, apparently under the impression that this meant he would see Silas again in his professional capacity as animal namer. Caleb nodded once, satisfied. Mara gathered the reins. "Thank you," she said. For the last time, and they both knew it was the last time. And after this, it would be something different, less gratitude, more whatever came next, which neither of them had a name for yet. "Drive careful," Silas said. "The ice on the north curve is still hard." "I know the road," she said. "I know you do," he said. She clicked to the horse. The wagon moved off down the cleared lane, Toby waving from the back until the trail bent, and the trees took them, and the sound of the wheels faded into the ordinary silence of the valley. Silas stood in front of his barn for a while after they were gone. The house behind him was empty again. One chair, one plate. The broom Mara had used leaning against the wall instead of hanging on its nail, because he didn't have a nail for it and had never needed one before. He went inside. He stood in the middle of the room. The silence was the same silence it had always been. Same boards, same stove, same single window, throwing the same rectangle of afternoon light across the same floor. But it was different now, and he knew it was different. And standing in it, trying to convince himself it wasn't different, was one of the more dishonest things he'd done in recent memory. He picked up the piece of paper Toby had drawn, the map of his property with the labeled cow sections and the careful, enormous letters, put it back on the mantel. He looked at it there for a moment. Then he went and got his coat, because there were fence lines to check before nightfall, and the work didn't care that he was standing around feeling things he hadn't planned to feel this week. He checked the fence lines. He did not stop feeling them. He rode out to the east pasture in the late afternoon, checking the wire, and when he got to the ridge line where the property opened up, and you could see the whole valley spread below the white fields, the dark lines of tree cover, the thin smoke rising from distant chimneys, he stopped his horse and looked south toward where the Witwitzlock homestead sat behind its stand of bare-limbed cottonwoods. He thought about Gideon Voss. He thought about a letter sent to Cheyenne 2 months ago that no one had answered. He thought about a boy who'd looked at him and said, "That's the same thing as afraid, just dressed up differently." He thought about Gerald Hatch, dead in a doorway in Laramie County, and the 8 years since, and the very specific shape of the mistake he'd been making all that time, the mistake of believing that removing yourself from other people's lives protected those people from harm, when really it just meant you weren't there when the harm arrived. He sat on his horse, on the ridge until the light started going golden and thin the way it does before a cold sunset. Then he turned back toward the barn. He had a fence line to finish and a stiff barn door to look at tomorrow, and somewhere in the back of his mind, still quiet but no longer entirely ignorable, the recognition that the hardest thing he'd done in 8 years was not the solitude. The hardest thing was standing in front of that door tonight when the wagon was already gone, and understanding, without wanting to, that the house he'd organized so carefully around one person wasn't built for one person at all. It never had been. He came by the next day like he said he would. Mara heard the horse before she saw him, the particular sound of hooves on the frozen lane, deliberate and unhurried, the way Silas Rourke moved through everything. She was at the kitchen window, washing breakfast dishes when he rode in, and she stood there for a moment, with her hands in the cold water, watching him dismount and tie the horse to the fence post and look at the barn door from 20 feet away with the expression of a man diagnosing a problem he's seen before. He hadn't said he was coming any reason other than the barn door. He'd said it to Caleb, technically. But he was here, and Mara dried her hands and went to the door and opened it before he knocked, which she could tell mildly surprised him. "The hinge is the problem," she said by way of greeting. "Upper left. It's pulling away from the frame." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I could see it from the lane." "I know you could," she said. "I was just saving time." He almost smiled. She was getting better at recognizing the almost smiles, which were the only kind he seemed to have. Caleb came out of the barn at the sound of Silas's voice. He was carrying a bucket, and his boots were already muddy, and it was not yet 8 in the morning, which Mara had given up commenting on because Caleb's relationship with early mornings was entirely Jonas' fault, and there was nothing to be done about it. I pulled the hinge pins last night, Caleb told Silas. Figured that'd save time. Silas looked at the boy. Did you use the right-sized driver? I used the one that fit, Caleb said. That's not the same thing. I know, but it worked. Silas went and looked. The hinge pins were out cleanly, no stripped threading, the frame around them not further damaged. Rather than as dark, he examined it with his eyes, pressing along the wood where the screws had pulled through. Wood's rotted here, he said, not from the hinge. From water coming in at the roof line above it. You fix the hinge without fixing the roof, you'll be back here in 6 months. Caleb came and looked where Silas was pressing. Can we fix both today? Depends on what you have for materials. They spent the next hour in Jonas Whitlock's small workshop, which was exactly the kind of workshop a competent man leaves behind. Organized, stocked, the tools hung rather than piled, extra hardware and labeled tins on a shelf. Silas went through it without comment, but Mara could tell he was taking inventory of more than the supplies. He was taking inventory of the man who'd built it. The kind of man who labeled his tins and kept his tools sharp was a specific kind of man, and Silas was reading that the same way he read everything else quietly, thoroughly, without announcing what he found. He was careful, Silas said, looking at the tin-marked barn hardware in Jonas's deliberate handwriting. About most things, Mara said. She was leaning in the workshop doorway with Nell in her arms, the baby awake and regarding the whole world with the grave, slightly suspicious expression she'd apparently been born with. He was careless about himself. Worked too hard, slept too little. I told him that for 11 years. Did he listen? Once. She looked at the handwriting on the tin. I used to think that was something I'd fix eventually, given enough time. She said it the way she said most true things straight out, without wrapping it in anything. Silas didn't respond immediately, and she appreciated that about him. The fact that he understood some statements weren't invitations to comfort. You have everything you need for the hinge and the roof section, he said. I'll need to borrow the ladder. It's on the south side of the barn, Caleb said. Go get it, Silas said, and Caleb went. They worked through the morning, the three of them Silas on the roof, with Caleb handing things up, Mara coming and going with Nell, occasionally standing at the base of the ladder to hold it steady and exchange the kind of practical, short-sentence conversation when they're working on something together. Not intimate conversation. Functional. And yet it had a warmth to it that caught Mara off guard once or twice, the warmth of simply not being alone in a task. She'd been alone in every task since October. She hadn't understood how heavy that was until some of the weight came off. Toby appeared around 10 o'clock, having apparently slept until a perfectly reasonable hour and seen no reason to apologize for it, and immediately began asking Silas questions from the base of the ladder. Silas answered all of them briefly, without looking down, and Mara noticed that the answers were never dismissive. He didn't say, I'm busy, or not now, or ask your mother. He just answered, flatly and honestly, and moved on to the next one, when it came. What's it like on the roof? Toby asked. Cold, Silas said. Can you see our whole farm from up there? Most of it. Can you see the Voss property? Silas paused. Mara looked up. Voss have property near here, he asked. His voice was level. To the north, Mara said. About 1.5 miles. He bought out the Decker family 2 years ago. Before that, it was the Garfield place, before Jonas and I came. Silas was quiet for a moment. Mara could hear him moving on the roof, but couldn't see his face. How long has he been in the valley? He asked. 4 years, maybe. He came from somewhere east. Never said exactly where. She paused. He's built a big operation. Bought 3 properties in 2 years. Everyone who sold said they felt like it was the right thing at the time. Afterward, some of them weren't sure. Were any of them sure before they signed? She thought about that. Clara Decker told me once that her husband felt like they'd made their decision before they really understood all the terms. That by the time they read everything carefully, there was already a momentum to it. She looked up at the roof line, like the deal had already happened, and signing was just the formality. Silas climbed down from the ladder. He stood on the ground and looked at the north tree line for a moment. Then he looked at Mara. I want to see the papers Voss's man brought last month, he said. The ones about the debt. I thought you said not to show anyone the land papers. I'm not asking for the deed. I'm asking for the papers Voss gave you. The ones you didn't sign." She studied him. "Why?" "Because if he's been doing this across the county, the papers will look similar. Same language, same structure. Men like Voss don't write new documents every time. They use the same template and change the names." She held his gaze. "You've seen this before." "Yes," he said, simply. She went inside and came back with a folded envelope. She held it out, and he took it and opened it and read it, standing there in the cold, the same way he did everything completely still, completely focused. The rest of the world not receiving any particular attention, while the thing in front of him received all of it. His face didn't change, but his jaw tightened once. "What?" she asked. He folded the papers. This language about the debt note, this exact phrase. Here he pointed without unfolding from memory. "I've seen this before." "Where?" He looked at her. Then he looked past her, at the barn, where Caleb had gone to return something to the workshop. Then he looked back. "Can Caleb read?" he asked. "Better than most adults," she said, with the particular pride of a mother who taught him herself. "I need someone who can copy out text accurately. Exactly as it appears, every word, every mark, not interpret it, copy it." She understood what he was asking before he finished saying it. "You want him to copy out the relevant sections of those papers, and anything else you have from Voss. Any letter, any document, any notice he's sent." He handed the papers back to her. "I'm going to ride to Coldwater Ridge this week and talk to Jonas Pike, but I want to go with more than a verbal account." Mara looked at the papers in her hand. She looked at Silas. "You said you weren't in law enforcement anymore." "I'm not," he said. "Then why are you doing this?" The question was honest, and he knew it was honest, and he stood in the cold for a moment in the particular discomfort of a man who has been asked to articulate something he's been avoiding articulating. "Because I rode into a blizzard 3 days ago and brought your family home," he said. "And now I know what's in front of you, and I know things about it that might be useful." He met her eyes. That's all. It wasn't all, and they both knew it wasn't all, but it was what he could say right now, and she respected that. "All right," she said. "I'll talk to Caleb." Caleb did not need much explaining. He sat at the kitchen table that afternoon with a clean sheet of paper and Jonas's good pen and copied out the Voss documents with the careful, even hand of a boy who took being trusted with something seriously. He asked 2 questions. What does this word mean, and is this mark a comma or a period, and otherwise worked in silence, while Mara nursed Nell and Silas sat across from him, reading through the stack of letters Mara had gathered from the box under the floorboard behind the pantry door. There were 7 letters total, going back 18 months. Silas read each one twice. He arranged them in order. He read them again. Mara watched him do this and thought, "Lawman, whatever he said about not being one anymore, the way a man reads documents tells you something about what he trained himself to do." And Silas Rourke read like someone who'd spent years learning to find the lie inside the official language. "The 4th letter," he said. "August of last year. He references a meeting at your property. Did you attend that meeting?" "Jonas did," she said. "I was in Coldwater Ridge with the boys." Jonas said a man came out to discuss the railroad survey, not Voss himself, one of his representatives. Jonas said the man was polite and the conversation was general, and he wasn't interested in selling. "Did Jonas sign anything at that meeting?" She felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. "He didn't tell me he did." "That's not the same thing," Silas said. She sat very still. "No, it's not. If Jonas signed anything at that meeting, even something that looked routine, a survey acknowledgement or a simple receipt, Voss may have used it as the basis for the debt claim." He set the letter down. "It wouldn't hold up to real examination, but it doesn't need to if you never ask for that examination. If you just sign what they put in front of you and move." Mara was looking at the table. Her hands were flat on the surface and very still. Nell had fallen asleep at her shoulder. "Jonas wouldn't have signed something without reading it," she said. "I believe that," Silas said. "And he did the organized workshop, the labeled tins, the careful handwriting on a deed filed in 1876 and kept in a hidden box for 5 years, said something about the kind of man Jonas Whitlock had been. But Voss's man may have shown him one document and swapped another before the signature happened. These men are practiced at it." Caleb had stopped writing. He was listening with his whole body. The way children listen when adults are talking about something that directly concerns their survival and have forgotten to pretend otherwise. Could they take the land? He asked. His voice was careful and flat, the same way Mara's voice went careful and flat when she was scared. Actually take it? Silas looked at him. He didn't soften it, because Caleb was not a child who benefited from softening, and they'd both figured that out by now. Not if we move first, he said. That's what this is about. Not fighting Voss getting in front of him. Getting to the sheriff and land office before he files whatever he's planning to file. And if we're not fast enough? Caleb asked. Then it gets harder, Silas said, but not impossible. Caleb looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up the pen and went back to copying. Silas rode to Coldwater Ridge 3 days later. He rode alone, early, before the valley had fully decided to be awake. He didn't tell Mara exactly when he was going, only that he was going, which she accepted without making it complicated. She was good at that, at letting happen without needing to manage every detail of them, which Silas understood was not passivity but a different kind of strength. The kind that knows the difference between what requires your hands and what requires your patience. Coldwater Ridge was 20 miles and a world away from the silence Silas had organized his life around. It had a main street and a mercantile and a church and a land office that was only open Tuesday and Thursday, and a sheriff's station that was attached to a 2-cell jail that had been built for a town of 400 and was now serving a town of nearly 9. Jonas Pike was at his desk when Silas walked in, and he looked up, and his expression did the thing that everyone's expression did when Silas Rourke walked into a room after 8 years of absence. A split second of recalibration, old information updating against current evidence. Silas, he said. Jonas. Silas said. They shook hands. Pike was 50-something, solid through the shoulders, with a gray beard that he'd apparently stopped fighting at some point in the last decade. He had the eyes of a man who'd seen enough of human behavior to be surprised by very little of it and disappointed by most. Sit down, Pike said. Silas sat down. He told him about Mara Whitlock. He told him about Gideon Voss. He told him about the letters, the papers, the unanswered request to the land office in Cheyenne, the meeting Jonas Whitlock had attended in August with a man he'd trusted to be straightforward and may have been given reason to regret. He put Caleb's copies on the desk. Pike read them without speaking. He had the same reading posture Silas had, completely still, everything else going off somewhere while the document received full attention. When he finished, he set them down and looked at Silas. You're the 4th person to bring me something like this in 6 months, he said. Silas felt the back of his neck go cold. Who else? Harlan Marsh, Ed Cooley, a widow named Pettigrew over on the West Ridge, but she signed in the end, and I can't help her now. Pike leaned back, each one alone, each one thinking they were the only one having trouble with Voss. They didn't talk to each other? Voss is smart about that. He works properties that are isolated from each other, families that don't socialize much, don't share information. He picks the ones who are already struggling behind on something, recently bereaved, dealing with a bad season, people who are too busy surviving to compare notes with their neighbors. Silas thought about Mara's words the night by the fire. He didn't knock, just walked in like he already owned it. The confidence of a man who'd done it before and had never found the door locked. Can you move on him? Silas asked. With what I have. Not yet. Pike looked at the copies. But with what you just brought me, and if Marsh and Cooley will give me statements, maybe yes. He paused. There's a territorial inspector coming through in 3 weeks. Land fraud cases go to him. If I have enough before he arrives. 3 weeks, Silas said. 3 weeks, Pike confirmed. They looked at each other. What does Voss do when someone gets too close? Silas asked. Pettigrew signed after her barn burned down, Pike said. We couldn't prove it wasn't an accident. The room was very quiet for a moment. How isolated is the Whitlock place? Pike asked. 2 miles from my property, Silas said. Less if you go through the east field. Are you staying close? The question had a specific weight to it that Silas understood was not casual. He met Pike's eyes. I'll be close, he said. Pike nodded. Good. Then you're not wearing a badge. No, I'm not asking you to. Pike started gathering the papers. I'm asking you to be careful. Voss has hired men and he's not squeamish about using them. If he finds out someone's been talking to me, he won't find out from me, Silas said. I know that. Pike looked at him. But that widow's got 3 children, Silas. Make sure she knows what she might be in the middle of before it comes to her door. Silas rode back to the Whitlock ranch that afternoon. He found Mara in the yard splitting wood, which she was doing competently but inefficiently, using a mower that was several heavier than was good for her build and swing with the grim determination of someone who does things the hard way when the right tools aren't available. He tied his horse without a word, picked up the wedge and hammer from the stack beside her, and started working beside her without asking. She watched him for one swing. Then she adjusted her grip on the maul and changed the angle slightly, the way someone adjusts when they understand what they've been doing wrong. They split wood for 10 minutes before she said anything. "What did he say?" she asked. You're not the only one Voss has been doing this to," Silas said. The maul stopped. She stood very still. "Who else?" she asked. He told her. Not everything, not the barn fire, not yet, not until he'd thought about how to say it. But the shape of it, 3 other families, isolated from each other, Voss working them one at a time. "How long has he been doing this?" she asked. "Longer than anyone realized, because no one was looking at the whole picture," he said. They were each looking at their own piece of it. She set the maul down. She stood with her hands at her sides and her jaw tight, and her eyes moving over the middle distance the way they moved when she was thinking hard about something that made her angry. "He knew Jonas died," she said. "Somebody told him, or he found out some other way, and he started moving faster because he thought I'd be easier to deal with than Jonas was." "Probably," Silas said. "He doesn't know me very well," she said. "No," Silas said, "he doesn't." She looked at him. "What do we do?" And there it was, the "we," said without hesitation, without looking to see if it landed wrong, because Mara Whitlock did not waste time on social performance when there was actual work to do. Silas filed it away and answered the question. "Pike needs statements from the other families before the territorial inspector arrives in 3 weeks. He also needs anything you have that documents the survey meeting Jonas attended in August. Letters, notes, anything Jonas may have written about it afterward." "I have his journal," she said. Silas stopped. "What kind of journal?" He kept a working journal, not personal practical. Dates, tasks, who came to the property, what was discussed. He'd been doing it since we filed the deed. She paused. He wrote about the August meeting. "Mara," Silas said carefully, "that journal may be the most important document you have." "I know," she said. "I read it 2 days after he died. I put it in the same box as the deed." She looked at him. "I wasn't sure it mattered until you told me about Voss." He stood there for a moment and understood something about her that he hadn't fully understood before, that she'd been collecting information, quietly and systematically, since October, not because she knew exactly what she was looking for, but because some part of her had recognized that she might need it. She'd been building a case in her head for 4 months, while appearing to simply be grieving and surviving, which she was also doing simultaneously. Jonas Whitlock had married a woman who was, under the right circumstances, formidable. Voss had made the mistake of not reading that correctly. "Can I see the journal?" Silas asked. "Yes," she said. Come inside." What Jonas Whitlock had written about the August meeting was brief, specific, and in the clear handwriting of a man who recorded facts rather than impressions. He'd written the date, the representative's name, a man called Burrell, and a summary of what was discussed. He'd written, showed me a survey document, and asked me to sign, acknowledging the property corners had been walked. I walked the corners with him myself first and confirmed they matched my deed. Signed the acknowledgement. Kept no copy. Should have asked for one. That last sentence, 4 words at the end of a practical accounting, should have asked. For one was the most heartbreaking thing Silas had read in recent memory. A man who'd been careful about everything, acknowledging one moment of insufficient caution, not knowing it would matter. Silas closed the journal carefully. "That acknowledgement is what Voss has been using," he said. "He'll have altered it or replaced it with a document that looks similar but says something different. A debt acknowledgement instead of a survey acknowledgement." Mara was across the table from him. She had both hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, and her face was the face of a woman processing something that made her want to put a fist through a wall, held in by the same practiced control that had been carrying her since October. "He let Jonas walk the corners himself," she said, "to make it look legitimate. Yes, he planned it a year ago. At least. At least, Silas said. She set down the cup. She stood up. She walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the north fields, at the tree line, beyond which Gideon Voss's bought-out property sat. I want to go talk to Harlan Marsh and Ed Cooley, she said. Silas looked at her. Why? Because Pike needs statements from them, and they haven't given them yet. She turned from the window. Why haven't they? Marsh's wife is sick. Cooley's alone on his property, and I think he's embarrassed he almost signed. Those aren't reasons not to talk, she said. Those are reasons they need someone to come to them, instead of waiting for them to come in. She met his eyes. Will you take me to them? He thought about what Pike had said, be careful. Voss has hired men. He's not squeamish. He thought about the barn fire that Pettigrew couldn't prove wasn't an accident. I'll take you, he said. But not yet. Not until we understand what Voss knows about what we're doing. How do we find that out? We watch, he said. And we wait for him to make a move. They didn't have to wait long. It was Caleb who saw them first. He'd been in the habit, since his father died, of doing a last check of the property before dark, not because anyone asked him to, but because it was a thing that needed doing, and he'd appointed himself to do it, the way he'd appointed himself to everything that needed a man and didn't have one. He was coming back from the east fence line when he saw the 2 riders on the ridge above the north pasture. They weren't moving, they were just sitting up there on the ridge, watching the house. He didn't run. He walked back to the barn at a normal pace, because Silas had told him once that running tells people you're afraid, and afraid people do what frightened people do, which is give information away. He put the tools away and went inside and told his mother quietly at the kitchen table. Mara heard it without visibly reacting. Then she went to the window and looked north. The ridge was empty. They'd gone, but they'd been there. Silas came by the next morning and she told him. He listened. His face did the controlled blank thing it did when he was angry. How long were they there? He asked. Caleb's said maybe 10 minutes, she said. Long enough. Long enough to see the layout. The house, the barn where the lane comes in. He looked toward the north ridge. He's moved up his timeline. Why? Because someone told him something changed. Either he found out I've been here, or he found out you went to town, or he found out about the copies. He paused. Voss has ears. He always has. That's how he picks his targets. He listens before he moves. Then we have less than 3 weeks, she said. Yes. Then we need to move faster. He looked at her. Mara, don't, she said, quietly but completely clearly. Don't tell me to be careful or go slow or wait. I have been careful and slow, and I have been waiting since October, and a man is sitting on my ridge watching my house. So tell me what we do, and we'll do it. He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window, and there was flour on her apron from the bread she'd been making, and her hair wasn't entirely where she'd put it, and her eyes were absolutely steady. We go to Marsh first, he said. Tomorrow. Good, she said. Now sit down and eat something. You look like a man who left his house without breakfast. He had, in fact, left his house without breakfast. He sat down. Caleb appeared from the back of the house, read the room the way he read everything, and sat down across from Silas without a word. He looked at his mother. He looked at Silas. He looked at the table. They're watching us, he said. Statement. Not a question. Yes, Silas said. Then they'll see us leaving tomorrow, Caleb said. Yes, Silas said. Caleb thought about this. So we should leave before it's light enough to see. Silas looked at him. Something shifted slightly in his face, the very faint expression of a man who keeps finding an 11-year-old child arriving at conclusions that the adults in the room haven't gotten to yet, and finding it both impressive and a little exhausting. Yes, he said. That's exactly right. Caleb nodded, satisfied. He reached across the table and took a piece of bread. I'll wake up early then, he said. You're not coming, Mara said. I know the way to Marsh's place, Caleb said. Papa took me there twice. It's a shortcut through the canyon on the east side that most people don't know about. Silas looked at Mara. She looked at Silas. He's not wrong, Silas said carefully. I know he's not wrong, Mara said. I'm trying to decide if the shortcut is worth taking my 11-year-old into a canyon before sunrise. I'll be with you, Silas said, both ways. She looked at Caleb. He was eating the bread and giving the impression of being entirely casual about the outcome of this discussion, which fooled neither of them. Fine, she said. But you stay behind me and you do exactly what Silas says. I always do what's smart, Caleb said. That's not the same thing, Mara said. Caleb considered this. It's usually the same thing, he said. Silas put his hand over his mouth for a moment. When he lowered it, his face was serious again, but the corners of his eyes had something in them that hadn't been there before. That night, Silas stayed late at the Whitlock property, longer than he usually did, until the boys were in bed, and Nell was down in the house quiet except for the fire and the wind outside, doing its usual investigation of the eaves. He and Mara sat at the kitchen table, with Jonas's journal open between them and the stack of Voss's letters beside it, and they worked through the timeline, together, what date each letter arrived, what it claimed, what Jonas had recorded in his journal about the same periods, building the picture from both sides. It was slow, careful work, the kind that requires two people who can hold a lot of information in their heads simultaneously and who trust each other enough to disagree about interpretations without making it personal. They disagreed about the third letter 3 times before Mara pointed at a specific line, and Silas read it again and acknowledged she was right. He did it without difficulty, the way a man acknowledges a fact. She noticed that too the way he treated being wrong as information rather than defeat. Jonas had been like that. Most men weren't. At some point, they'd moved from sitting across from each other to sitting side by side to better see the documents. Silas became aware of this gradually, the way you become aware of temperature, not in one moment, but in the accumulation of moments. Her shoulder was 6 inches from his. He could hear her breathing. She smelled like bread and wood smoke. He moved his chair back approximately 4 inches. Not pointedly, just enough. She noticed. He could tell she noticed from the quality of the silence that followed. But she didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything, and they went back to the documents, which was the right call. August 14th, Mara said. That's when Jonas met with Burrell. Voss's next letter is September 3rd. He waited 3 weeks before following up, giving Jonas time to forget exactly what he'd signed, Silas said. If enough time passes, the details soften. You sign something in August. By September, you remember the general outline, but not the specific wording. Jonas would remember, she said. Voss didn't know Jonas, Silas said. He knew a homesteader with a young family and a recent good land year who had no obvious reason to be suspicious of a survey company representative. Mara was quiet for a moment. He watched us, she said, before he came. He already knew things about us before that first letter arrived. Yes, Silas said. How do you do that to people, she said. Not a question, really. More like something that needed to be said out loud, and the room was the right audience for it. Silas looked at the table. He thought about men like Gideon Voss, the specific type not violent by nature, not cruel for its own sake, but so entirely focused on the acquisition of things that other people existed only in relation to their usefulness. He'd met men like that when he was wearing a badge, had arrested 2 of them, had understood, arresting them, that what they shared was not a particular hunger, but a particular blindness. They genuinely could not see the damage behind them, because their eyes were always pointed forward at the next property, the next signature, the next piece of land that would add to the total of what they could call theirs. They don't think about it, he said. That's the honest answer. It's not that they don't care. It's that the people in the way don't fully exist to them. Mara looked at him. You've known men like this. Yes, he said. From before, she said. Not pushing, just acknowledging. Yes, he said. The fire popped. Outside, something rustled along the north side of the house. Probably a rabbit, probably nothing, and they both went still for a moment, listening with the particular alertness of people who've been told there's a reason to be alert. Silence, just the wind. Mara let out a slow breath. I'm going to bed, she said. We leave at 5. I'll be here at 4:30, he said. I'll bring the lantern. She stood up. She gathered the papers and put them back in order, the same careful order Silas used, which he noticed without commenting on. She started toward the back of the house, then stopped. She turned around. She looked at him, standing there with his coat in his hands, about to leave. Silas, she said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. All right, he said. Can we actually stop him? Or are we doing all this so we can tell ourselves we tried? He held her gaze. He'd been asked versions of this question before, in another life, by people who needed to know if help was real or performative. He'd learned that the worst thing you can do is give someone false certainty. The second worst is give them nothing. I think we can stop him, he said. I think the journal and the copies, and what Marsh and Cooley can add to it, gives Pike enough to move on before Voss files anything. But there are things that could go wrong. He could move faster than we do. He could file in a different jurisdiction. He might have someone in the Cheyenne land office that might be why your letter went unanswered. She absorbed all of this, but you think we have a real chance? Yes, he said, I think we have a real chance. She nodded. She turned back toward the hallway. Mara, his voice stopped her again. She looked back. He had his coat half on, and the look of a man who'd said the reasonable thing, and was about to say the true thing, and was aware that those were sometimes different things. Whatever happens with Voss, he said, you're not going to lose this land. I'm not going to let that happen. The words were simple, and she heard them the same way. She heard everything he said straight through, without the layer of interpretation that other people's words required. Because Silas Rourke did not say things he didn't mean. She had understood that about him from the second night in his house. She stood in the hallway doorway for a moment. I know, she said, and she meant it the same way. She went to bed. Silas put on his coat and checked the door and the window latch on his way out, old habits, and walked to his horse in the dark, and stood there for a moment looking at the house. The lamp in the kitchen was still burning. She'd left it for him to see by on his way out. Small thing. He'd done the same for her 2 mornings ago, the coffee left where she'd find it. He hadn't thought about Gerald Hatch in 3 days. That wasn't usual. He thought about Gerald most days, had thought about him most days for 8 years, the specific weight of a loss that was also a judgment on himself. The fact that its windows were dark, the fact that it had been absent didn't mean anything about whether he'd been forgiven or whether he deserved to be, and he was not naive enough to believe it did. But it meant something about where his attention was living now. He mounted and rode home through the dark, the cold settling down on everything the way cold does in Wyoming when it means business. And he thought about 5 o'clock and a canyon shortcut and a boy who already knew the way and a woman who had been building a case in a hidden box for 4 months, while everyone around her saw only a widow learning to survive. And somewhere in the cold and the dark and the quiet, something that had been still for a very long time was starting, slowly and reluctantly and with no certainty about where it was going, to move. They left at 4:50 because Caleb was already dressed, and at the door, when Silas arrived at 4:30, holding the lantern, Silas had brought on his last visit and looking at him with the expression of a boy who had set his own internal clock and was mildly offended that anyone thought he might oversleep. Canyon route was exactly what Caleb had described, a narrow cut through the east ridge that took 20 minutes off the Marsh property approach and kept them below the sight line of anyone watching from the north ridge. Silas rode ahead with the lantern. Mara rode behind him. Caleb brought up the rear on the old gray mare that had been Jonas's working horse, sitting the saddle with the easy comfort of a boy who'd been riding before he could read. Nobody talked much. The dark was the specific pre-dawn dark that has its own quality, not quite night anymore. Not yet morning, the world holding its breath between one thing and the next. The horse's breath came in visible puffs. Canyon walls were close enough that Silas could have touched either side with an extended arm, and the sound of the hooves echoed off the rock in a way that made them sound like more people than they were. They came out of the canyon onto the marsh properties as the sky was starting to separate itself from the land. That first gray edge of light that doesn't illuminate anything yet, but tells you it's coming. Harlan Marsh's house was dark. Silas dismounted and knocked. It took a while. Then a lamp came on inside, moving from a back room toward the front, and the door opened on a man in his 60s with the face of someone pulled from sleep by something he was already expecting to be bad news. He looked at Silas. He looked at Mara. He looked at Caleb on the gray mare. Rourke, he said, flat but not unfriendly. Harlan, this is Mara Whitlock. She's had the same trouble with Voss you've had. Marsh looked at Mara for a long moment. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in, he said. My wife's sleeping. Keep your voices down. The Marsh kitchen was warmer than Silas expected. Someone had kept the fire up through the night, and as Silas's eyes adjusted, he understood why. Through the doorway to the back room, he could see a woman in a bed, not asleep, watching them. Her face had the yellowish cast of someone who'd been ill a long time, the kind of illness that takes its time and doesn't give much back. Marsh caught him looking. Lungs, he said quietly. Since December. I'm sorry, Mara said. She said it the way Silas had said it to her, simply, without ornamentation. Marsh sat down at his table. He was already looking at them, with the expression of a man who'd made a decision about something, before they arrived. I'll talk to Pike, he said. I've been meaning to. He stopped, looked at his hands. She needed me here. I kept putting it off. We understand, Mara said. No, Marsh said. You're polite to say so, but I should have gone in November, before the weather turned. He looked up at her. What happened to you? With Voss, told him. Briefly, clearly, in the same organized way she'd told Silas. When she got to the part about Jonas's journal and the August survey meeting, Marsh's jaw tightened. He said. Mara stopped. You know him? He came here in July. Said he was doing a survey of the North Valley properties. Very polite. Very professional. Marsh's voice had the specific bitterness of a man recounting how he'd been handled by someone who knew exactly how to handle him. Showed me a document about the east fence line. Asked me to sign confirming the survey markers matched my deed. I walked the markers myself. They matched. Did you keep a copy of what you signed? Silas asked. He said he'd send one. He never did. Marsh looked at the table. When Voss's letter came in October, claiming I owed a balance on the original land purchase, I couldn't find anything to contradict it. But I knew I hadn't taken a balance. I paid cash for this land in 1,873. Do you have the receipt from the original purchase? Mara asked. Marsh looked at her. Then he got up without a word and went to a shelf behind the door and pulled down a tin box. He opened it and came back to the table and put down a yellowed paper with a notary seal. Mara picked it up. Read it, handed it to Silas. He read it and set it down. Paid in full, Silas said. Notarized. August 3rd, 1,873. That's what I tried to tell Voss's man, Marsh said. He said the original sale had a secondary note that wasn't in the main record, that it was a common arrangement from that period. He paused. I'm not an uneducated man, but he used language I wasn't entirely sure of, and he had documents that looked official. And he stopped. He knew how to make you feel like the one who didn't understand. Mara said quietly. Marsh looked at her. Yes, he said. That's exactly what it was. There was a sound from the back room, a cough, thin and prolonged, that went on longer than anyone at the table was comfortable with. Marsh was on his feet before it ended. He went to the doorway. I'm fine, came a woman's voice, rough but firm. Don't fuss. I'm not fussing, Marsh said. You're standing there with your shoulders up around your ears, the woman said. That's fussing. Marsh's shoulders came down approximately 1 inch. He turned back to the table with the expression of a man who is thoroughly outmaneuvered in his own house on a regular basis, and has made his peace with it. Mara was almost smiling. Tell Pike I'll come in Thursday, Marsh said. I'll bring the original receipt and everything Voss sent me. He looked at Silas. Is it enough? What we have? I don't know yet, Silas said, but it's more than it was yesterday. They rode to Ed Cooley's property next, which was further north and required going around rather than through, because the canyon route didn't extend that far. By the time they arrived, the morning was fully light, cold and clear, and Cooley was already in his yard, repairing a section of fence with the focused aggression of a man working out something that had nothing to do with fence repair. He was younger than Marsh, maybe late 30s, broad through the back, with the particular set to his face of someone who has been embarrassed about something for months, and carries the embarrassment in his body the way some men carry old injuries. He saw Silas first and stopped working. Then he saw Mara, and something shifted in his face that was harder to read, not suspicion, but not quite welcome either. More like the expression of a man who doesn't want to be seen in the middle of what he's in the middle of. Cooley, Silas said. Rourke. He looked at Mara. Mrs. Whitlock. You know who I am? Mara said. Valley's smaller than it looks, Cooley said. He set down the fencing tool. I was sorry to hear about Jonas. He was a decent man. He was, Mara said. Mr. Cooley, I think you know why we're here. I think I do, Cooley said. He looked at the fence line. He looked at his hands. I almost signed, he said. I had the pen in my hand. What stopped you? Silas asked. Cooley was quiet for a moment. My daughter, he said. She was visiting from Laramie. She came in from the other room while Voss's man was talking, and She looked at the papers on the table, and she looked at me, and she said, "Dad, what are those?" And something about the way she said it, he stopped. I told Voss's man I needed more time. He said the offer expired that night. I said, "Then it expires." He looked up, he left. And I've been waiting for the other shoe to drop ever since. It hasn't dropped yet, Silas said, but it's going to. And when it does, Pike needs to be ready. Cooley looked at him steadily. "You're asking me to give a statement." "Yes," Silas said. "And you think that's enough to stop him? With what Marsh has and what misses?" Whitlock has yes. "I think it's enough to give the territorial inspector reason to open a formal investigation, which means Voss can't file anything against any of your properties without it going through that investigation first." Cooley looked at Mara. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Not hostile, genuinely asking. "You could have sold and moved somewhere easier. Plenty of widows would have." Mara looked at him. She didn't bristle at the word widow, and she didn't perform offense at the suggestion. She just answered the question. "My husband built that house," she said. "He filed that deed. He walked those corners and logged it in his journal the same day he did it, because he was a man who kept records of things that mattered." She paused. "He never got to meet our daughter. She was born the week after he died. She's going to grow up on that land. That's not negotiable." Cooley was quiet for a long moment. "I'll go to Pike tomorrow," he said, "first thing." They were back at the Whitlock property by noon. Caleb unsaddled the horses without being asked, while Mara went inside to check on Nell, who had been left in the capable, if occasionally distracted, care of Toby, who had apparently spent the morning introducing Nell to every object in the kitchen by name and explaining its function to her at length. "She knows what a ladle is now," Toby reported, with the satisfaction of genuine educational accomplishment. "Good," Mara said. She picked up the baby and held her, and stood in the middle of her kitchen for a moment with her eyes closed. Not praying, just standing, just being in the room. Silas came in from outside. He stopped in the doorway. Seeing her like that, eyes closed, baby against her chest, just standing, and he started to back out quietly. "You don't have to leave," she said without opening her eyes. Came in. He sat down at the table. He put his hat on the seat beside him. She opened her eyes. She looked at him. "What do we do now?" "We wait for Pike to move," he said. "Marsh goes in Thursday, Cooley tomorrow. That should be enough for Pike to contact the territorial inspector's office and request an early arrival." He paused. "And we stay alert." She nodded the riders on the ridge. "They were watching to see the layout," he said. "If Voss decides to move before Pike does, he'll come at night. He'll want it to look like a civil matter papers being served, a debt being collected. He'll bring enough men to make it feel official. Can he be stopped if he shows up here?" Silas looked at her. "With what Pike has, I believe so. But it depends on timing." He said it the way he'd answered her before, honestly, without the false bottom of reassurance that would collapse under weight. "If Pike gets the warrants before Voss moves, yes. If Voss moves first, it gets harder to undo." "Then we need Pike to move faster," she said. "I'm going back to Coldwater Ridge tomorrow," he said. "I'll push him." She nodded. "All right." Then she sat down across from him and settled Nell in the crook of her arm and looked at him with the directness that he'd come to understand was simply how she looked at things she was thinking about seriously. "Silas," she said, "what happened to the badge?" He met her eyes. "You asked me that once before. You answered the edges of it," she said. "I'm asking the center." He looked at the table for a moment. He'd had 8 years of not answering this question because he hadn't had anyone asking it directly. And the people who might have asked it in the first years after Gerald died, he'd made sure weren't close enough to ask. Gerald Hatch was 31, he said. He had a wife named Catherine and a daughter named Ruth who was 4 years old. Ruth would be 12 now. He said it with the precision of someone who has kept count. "After Gerald died, I went to see Catherine. It was the hardest thing I'd done in my life up to that point. She didn't blame me." He stopped. That was somehow worse than if she had. Mara waited. She said Gerald chose the job knowing what it could cost. She said blaming me would be easy and wrong. He pressed his mouth together. I couldn't accept that. I decided instead that the safest thing was to be responsible for no one. If no one depended on me, no one would pay the price of my decisions. "That's not what happened, though," Mara said. "Is it?" He looked at her. "People still paid a price," she said. "They just paid it the other way. The ones who could have used your help and didn't have it." He held her gaze. I've been working on that one, he said. I know you have, she said. I've been watching you work on it. He looked at Nell. The baby was studying his face with the solemn attention of a creature, encountering something repeatedly, and still finding it worth examining. She looks like him, Silas said. Your husband. The eyes. Mara looked down at her daughter. I know, she said. I look for that every morning. First thing. She said it simply, without sadness being the only thing in it. There was love in it, and grief in it, and something that was acceptance, without being resignation. The kind of thing that takes a very long time to get to. Silas thought, this is what it looks like when someone carries something enormous and carries it well. Not easily well. There's a difference, and most people who haven't had to carry it don't understand the difference. He understood it. He thought about the map Toby had drawn, still on his mantel. He thought about Caleb asking, will you come see how we fix the barn door? And then knowing the shortcut through the canyon without needing to be told. He thought about Mara saying we do next, without looking up to see if it landed wrong. He put these things in a specific internal drawer and closed it, because now was not the time, and he was not a man who acted on things before he understood them fully. Picked up his hat. I'll be here tomorrow at 6. I want to leave for Coldwater Ridge early. I'll have coffee, she said. He was at the door when it happened. The sound not dramatic, not loud, just the specific sound of a horse being ridden hard on the frozen lane, coming fast from the north. He was outside before he'd made a conscious decision to move, hand on the post, watching the lane. One rider, coming from the direction of the Voss property. Silas stepped off the porch. He put himself between the lane and the house door, without making a show of it, the way a man positions himself when he's done it before and knows how it should look. The rider pulled up hard 30 feet out. Young, 20-something, wearing a heavy coat with Voss's brand on the saddle. Not one of the men from the ridge, someone else, someone Silas hadn't seen before. The rider looked at Silas, recalibrated visibly. I'm looking for Mrs. Whitlock, he said. His voice was trying for authority and missing by a fair distance. She's not available, Silas said. I have documents that need to be delivered to her directly. Leave them with me. The rider looked uncertain. He had the look of a young man sent to do an errand by someone he was afraid of, who had not anticipated the errand having an obstacle. My employer said, I heard what you said, Silas said. Leave the documents with me or take them back. Those are your options. A long moment. Then the rider reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope and held it out. He didn't ride closer. He leaned out as far as he could from the saddle until Silas walked forward and took it. The rider turned and rode back the way he came without another word. Silas looked at the envelope. His name wasn't on it. Mara Whitlock was written on the front in a precise commercial hand. He went inside. Mara was standing in the middle of the kitchen with Nell in her arms, having heard the rider come and go. Caleb was in the doorway from the back hall. Toby was behind him, looking around his brother's shoulder with wide, interested eyes. Silas put the envelope on the table. Mara handed Nell to Caleb without looking. She sat down and opened the envelope. It was a single page, official-looking header, dense print in the middle section, and a signature at the bottom over a notary seal. She read it. Her face changed in a specific way, not panic, not collapse, something colder than either of those. The expression of someone who has been preparing for a blow and feels it land and makes note of exactly where. She set it down and pushed it across the table to Silas. He read it. It was a formal notice of debt collection, citing a balance of $412 alleged to be owed on the original Whitlock land purchase, with a notarized signature identified as Jonas Whitlock's attached to a promissory note dated August 14th, the same date as the survey meeting. The August 14th meeting. The document Jonas had signed acknowledging the survey corners. Except this was not a survey acknowledgement. This was a promissory note for $412. Same date, different document. Jonas's signature on something he had never agreed to. He moved up his timeline, Silas said. He knows we've been talking to people, Mara said. Her voice was level, very level. The kind of level that costs something to maintain. He has 10 days to file this in the land court before the territorial inspector arrives, Silas said. If he files it first, it ties up the property in litigation. Even if we win eventually, the process takes. How long, she asked. A year, maybe 2. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then opened them. Can we counterfile something before he does? Not without a lawyer and the right documents, and that takes time we don't have. He looked at the signature on the notice. The notary seal was real. He could tell from the impression in the paper. But the document itself was fraudulent. The signature transferred or replicated from whatever Jonas had actually signed. He'd seen this before in another life, done with enough craft to fool a court clerk on a busy day. What if Pike files something? She asked. A criminal complaint goes to a different court than a land claim, he said. They don't automatically stop each other. Then we need both, she said. We need Pike to file criminal charges, and we need the land claim blocked. Yes, he said. How do we block the land claim? He thought about it. He thought about what he knew and what Jonas Pike knew and what 3 families' worth of documentation added up to when you laid it out in the right order. Jonas's journal, he said. The entry for August 14th is specifically what he signed and specifically what he didn't sign. If we get that to the land court before Voss files, it puts his document in question. He paused. But we have to get there before he files. Which means today. She was already standing. How long to Coldwater Ridge? 2 hours. She looked at the clock on the shelf. It was just past 1 in the afternoon. We can be there by 3. The land court closes at 4, he said. It's going to be close. She looked at Caleb. Can you manage here until we're back? Caleb's jaw was set in a way that would have looked like stubbornness on another face, but on his was just resolve. Yes, he said. Keep Toby inside, she said. Don't let anyone on the property. And if someone comes? Caleb asked. He was looking at Silas when he said it. Silas met his eyes. You don't have to let them in, he said. And you don't have to argue with them. Just tell them your mother will return by evening and close the door. What if they don't take that for an answer? Then you go out the back and ride to my property, Silas said. You know the way. I know the way, Caleb said. Silas turned to Mara. Get the journal and the deed, both of them. Don't leave either here. She was already moving. They rode hard to Coldwater Ridge. Not carelessly, the ice on the north section of the road was still treacherous in the shade patches, but as fast as the conditions allowed, which was faster than comfortable. Mara rode well, better than Silas had registered in the earlier trips, with the ease of someone who'd grown up on horseback and hadn't lost it. They didn't talk on the road. There wasn't room for it between the speed and the focus and the particular quality of the air between 2 people who both understand that something has shifted into a different register, and conversation would use up attention better spent elsewhere. The land court in Coldwater Ridge was in the back section of the Territorial Records building, which shared a wall with the feed store and smelled accordingly. Clerk was a thin man of about 50, with the careful handwriting of someone who valued order, and the slightly harassed expression of someone whose order was regularly disrupted by people arriving near closing time with complicated situations. His name was Alderman. Silas knew him from before. Rourke, Alderman said, looking up. Henry, Silas said. This is Mahoney Whitlock. She has a title dispute she needs to file a protective notation on before Gideon Voss files a fraudulent debt claim against her property. Alderman looked at Mara. He looked at the documents she placed on the counter. He looked at the clock on the wall, which read 10 past 3. Tell me, he said to Mara, and picked up the journal. Mara told him. She was concise and specific and presented things in order of relevance rather than order of occurrence, which Silas noticed was an organizational skill that most people under pressure don't have. She put the journal entry in front of him first, then the original deed, then Voss's notice, then the copies of the previous letters. Alderman read the journal entry. He read the deed. He looked at the notarized signature on Voss's notice, and he read the journal entry again. He set everything down. He took his glasses off and cleaned them, which Silas understood was the thing Henry Alderman did when he'd understood something he wished he hadn't. The date matches his notation, Alderman said. The journal entry and the notice are both dated August 14th. Yes, Mara said, and he's saying this is what he signed. And Voss is saying this, he tapped the notice, is what he signed. Yes, Mara said, and the original deed shows the property is free and clear, paid in full, no secondary note. Yes. Alderman put his glasses back on. He was looking at the counter. His jaw was doing the thing that jaws do when a man is deciding something. I can file a notation of disputed authenticity on the Whitlock parcel, he said. That means if Voss files his claim, It automatically goes to contested hearing rather than summary judgment. It doesn't stop him from filing. But it means he can't get a quick ruling. He looked at Mara. A contested hearing needs to go in front of a territorial judge. With the inspector arriving in 3 weeks, the timing works, Silas said. If Pike has what he needs by then, yes, Alderman said. He looked at Silas. Does he? He will, Silas said. Alderman looked at him for a long moment. He'd known Silas Rourke in the years before, in the years of the badge, and he was clearly doing the same calculation everyone did when they encountered Silas' now old information. Current evidence, something shifting in the assessment. All right, Alderman said. He pulled out the relevant form. Mrs. Whitlock, I need you to sign here and here, and I need the journal and a copy of the deed as supporting exhibits. He looked at her. The originals I'll need to keep. The journal is the only copy, Mara said. My husband kept one journal. I understand. I'll treat it accordingly. She looked at the journal for a moment. Jonas's handwriting on the cover. Then she put it on the counter and signed where Alderman indicated. They were back on the street by 10 to 4. Silas went directly to Pike's office. Pike read Voss's notice quickly and set it down and looked at the wall for a moment in the way of a man adding a column and not enjoying the sum. He's filing within the week, Silas said. He wouldn't have sent this otherwise. I know, Pike said. He opened his desk drawer and took out a folder thick with papers. Cooley came in this morning. Marsh sent his son with a statement and the original receipt. I've been writing up the complaint all afternoon. Is it enough? It's close. Pike looked at him. There's something missing. Something that connects the properties to each other, not just the same methods, but the same documents. If I can show the inspector that Burrell used the same survey form at every property and the same template was then altered into a debt notice. I have Caleb's copies, Silas said. He pulled them from inside his coat. Every document Voss sent the Whitlocks, copied exactly. Took them. He spread them on the desk beside the papers. Marsh and Cooley had provided. He looked at them for 30 seconds. Same template, he said. Same numbered clause structure. The language in Section 3 is identical across all 4 documents. He looked up. Silas, this is it. Can you file tonight? I can file a preliminary complaint tonight. Criminal charges for fraud and falsification. I'll request the inspector's arrival be moved up. He paused. Once I file, Voss will know. He'll move fast. How fast? Tonight. Tomorrow night at the latest. If he thinks he can get onto that property and serve papers before my warrants are in hand. He'll try, Silas said. He'll try, Pike confirmed. They looked at each other. I need to get back to the Whitlock property, Silas said. Pike nodded. Then he opened his desk drawer again and took out something and put it on the desk between them. It was a badge. Not Silas's old badge, a different one. A deputy's badge. The spare Pike kept for emergencies. I'm not asking you to take it, Pike said. I'm telling you it's there. Silas looked at it. He looked at the shape of it on the desk. The dull metal, the scratched star, the weight of what it represented, and the weight of what it had cost him the last time he'd worn one. He thought about Caleb saying, that's the same thing as afraid, just dressed up differently. He thought about a woman who rode hard for 2 hours with a journal that was the only copy of her dead husband's words and put it on a counter without hesitating. He thought about Gerald Hatch, dead in a doorway, and Catherine who hadn't blamed him and had somehow made it worse, and 12-year-old Ruth in Casper, who didn't know a man named Silas Rourke, had spent 8 years trying to undo a 30-minute decision. He picked up the badge. He put it in his coat pocket. I'll be at the Whitlock property tonight, he said. Get the warrants as fast as you can. I'll ride out as soon as I have them, Pike said. Silas went back to where Mara was waiting with the horses. She looked at his face, and then she looked at his coat pocket, at the slight weight visible there, the outline of something small and specific. She didn't say anything. She mounted. They rode back hard in the fading afternoon light, the sun going down behind the western ridge, and the temperature dropping in that fast. Serious way it drops in Wyoming when the light goes, cold coming in behind the warmth, like something that had been waiting just off stage. They came down the canyon route because it was faster. Silas had the lantern and Mara rode close behind him, the horse's breath fogging in the cold dark of the canyon walls, hooves on frozen ground, and Silas's mind running through geometry how far back Voss was, what he knew, when he'd move, what the night would look like if they didn't have enough time. They came out of the canyon, onto the Whitlock lane, and Silas saw the house and the windows were lit, and the barn was quiet, and Caleb was standing on the porch, waiting for them with a lantern in his hand. He looked like his father standing there. Silas didn't say that, but he thought it. Nobody came, Caleb said as they rode in. He looked at their faces. But something happened. Voss sent a notice today, Mara said, dismounting. We filed a counter-rotation at the land court. Pike is filing criminal charges tonight. She looked at her son. We're going to stay close tonight, all of us. Caleb looked at Silas. Are they coming? Silas tied his horse. He looked at Caleb with the honesty the boy had always demanded and always deserved. Maybe, he said. I don't know when, but we're going to be ready. Caleb nodded once. No dramatics. No visible fear, or rather visible fear managed in the specific way this boy had learned to manage it. Acknowledged, filed, moved past. I'll check the barn, he said. I'll come with you, Silas said. They went together into the dark of the barn, the lantern throwing their shadows long against the hay-stacked walls, and Silas did a check of the doors and the windows and the back approach, the way he'd done it 100 times in another life, his hands remembering the routine before his mind did. He reached into his coat and put the badge in his breast pocket, not visible, not hidden, just there. He thought about Gerald Hatch. He thought, I'm not making the same mistake twice. The mistake wasn't going in. The mistake was going in without enough people. Tonight he intended to have enough people. He looked at Caleb, checking the horse's accused water with the same careful competence he brought to everything. When we get inside, Silas said, I'm going to ask you to do one thing. If anything happens tonight, if men come to this property, and it gets complicated in any way, I need you to take the horses and ride the North Ridge Road and tell every neighbor you can find what's happening here. Caleb looked at him. You mean leave? I mean ride for help, Silas said. There's a difference. Caleb thought about this, like what Papa would have done. Silas looked at him, exactly like that. Caleb nodded slowly. He hung the water bucket back on its hook. He turned to Silas. Are you scared? He asked. Silas thought about the honest answer. A little, he said. Me too, Caleb said. He picked up the lantern. Okay, let's go inside. They went inside. The house was warm. Toby had somehow convinced Mara to let him stay up past his usual hour and was sitting at the table with elaborate innocence, obviously having lobbied for this position. Nell was in her basket near the stove, asleep, fist curled beside her cheek. Mara had put supper on. She looked at Silas when he came in, that direct look, taking inventory. You checked the approaches? She asked. All of them, he said. We'll keep the east window dark tonight. I want to be able to see the lane without being seen. She nodded. Sit down, she said. Eat something first. Whatever happens, you need to eat. He sat down. Outside, the Wyoming night came in cold and absolute, stars hard overhead, and the ridge lines dark against the darker sky. And somewhere to the north, in a large house that the Voss had bought with other people's land and other people's losses, a man was looking at the same night and making his calculations. Silas ate. He kept his coat on. They came at 10 o'clock. Silas heard them before anyone else did the sound of multiple horses on the frozen lane, not hurrying, which was somehow worse than if they'd been hurrying. Men who ride slowly toward something they intend to take believe they've already taken it. He was at the east window with the lamp turned down before the sound registered in the room behind him. How many? Mara said from across the kitchen. She was already on her feet. 4 horses, he said. Maybe 5. He turned from the window. Caleb. Caleb was in the doorway from the back hall, boots already on. He'd sat up past 10 without anyone telling him to stay up. The way a person sits up who has decided that tonight is not a night for sleeping, regardless of what the adults say. The North Ridge Road, Silas said. You remember? I remember, Caleb said. Not yet. Wait until I tell you. Caleb moved to the back door and stood beside it and put his hand on the latch. 7 seconds of preparation. That was all. Then he was still watching Silas, waiting. Toby was on the floor beside the stove with his knees pulled up, understanding in the instinctive way of young children that this was a moment for small and quiet, that his job right now was to take up as little space as possible. He had one hand on Nell's basket, not consciously protective, probably, just touching the thing closest to him. Mara stood in the center of the kitchen. The horses stopped outside, then boots on frozen ground. Then a knock on the door, 3 knocks, deliberate and official sounding. The kind of knock designed to communicate authority before anyone has said a word. Mara looked at Silas. He nodded once. She opened the door. Gideon Voss stood on her porch. He was better dressed than she'd remembered, heavy wool coat, good boots, the presentation of a man of legitimate business. Behind him, visible in the dark, 4 men, 2 on horseback still, 2 dismounted. His eyes went past Mara immediately and found Silas standing beside the east window, and something moved in them, a rapid assessment, a recalibration, and then the practiced expression came back down over it like a curtain. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "I have some papers that require your immediate attention." "I received your notice this afternoon," Mara said. "I've already taken it to the land court." Something flickered. "The land court can't help you with a private debt obligation." "It can when the document claiming that obligation is fraudulent," she said. Voss's jaw moved. One of the men behind him shifted his weight. The horses breathed cold air in visible clouds. "I think," Voss said carefully, "there may be some confusion about your late husband's arrangements that I can help clarify. If you'll simply allow me to come inside and—" "No," Mara said. "Just that. No elaboration. No apology for the directness." Voss looked past her at Silas again. "Who are you?" he said. Silas reached into his breast pocket and pinned the badge on the outside of his coat where the lamplight from the kitchen could catch it. He didn't move from where he was standing. He didn't raise his voice. "Deputy Silas Rourke," he said, "and you're on private property at 10 o'clock at night with hired men, Mr. Voss. I'd think carefully about your next words." Voss stared at the badge. Something happened in his face that he controlled very quickly, but not quickly enough a crack. A moment of genuine uncertainty, the first one Silas had seen in him. "That badge doesn't give you jurisdiction over a civil debt matter," Voss said. "You're right," Silas said. "It doesn't. But criminal fraud does." He took a step toward the door. "Sheriff Pike filed a formal criminal complaint against you this evening. Fraud, falsification of territorial land records, coercion across multiple properties in Coldwater Ridge County." He said it in the same tone he'd used for everything. Tonight level, unhurried, not performing the authority because he didn't need to perform it. The complaint includes witness statements from Harlan Marsh, Ed Cooley, and Mara Whitlock, along with physical documentation of the survey forms your man Burrell used, and the debt notices derived from them. Silence. One of the men on horseback moved slightly, and Silas looked at him. Just a look, and the man went still again. "You have no warrants," Voss said. His voice had thinned. "Not in my hand," Silas said. "Pike will be here inside an hour with them." He met Voss's eyes. "You can stay on this property until he arrives, and we do this the hard way. Or you can ride back to your place, and we do it the slightly less hard way. Either suits me." Voss looked at Mara. Something crossed his face that might have been, in a different man, shame. But in Voss it was only the calculation of a man who has realized a position is untenable and is already looking for the exit. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes," Mara said, "it is." She said it quietly. Not triumphant. Not angry even, which was the more devastating version. Just a woman stating a fact she was certain of. Voss turned. He said something low to the men behind him, and they mounted and rode, and he rode after, and the sound of the horses faded back up the lane and into the dark of the north road. Mara stood in the open doorway for a moment. The cold came in around her. Then she closed the door. She stood with her back to it, and her hands behind her, still holding the latch, and she closed her eyes and breathed out slowly. Not relief, not yet. Relief comes after, when the thing is fully finished and you can believe it. This was more like the breath you take when you've been holding something heavy and you've set it down, but your arms don't quite believe yet that they're empty. "Caleb," she said. "I'm here," he said, from beside the back door. He hadn't moved. "It's all right," she said. "You can come away from the door." He came into the kitchen. He looked at the front door. He looked at Silas. "Is it actually all right?" he asked, because Caleb had been around enough to understand that adults sometimes said it's all right before it was actually all right. "Not completely," Silas said. "Not until Pike arrives with the warrants. But the worst of it is done." Caleb accepted this with the gravity it deserved. Then he looked at Toby, still on the floor beside the stove. "You can breathe," Caleb told him. Toby took a very large breath, apparently having been doing exactly what Caleb suggested he stop doing. He looked at Silas. Did you scare him away? He asked. He scared himself, Silas said. I just made sure he understood what he was scared of. Toby thought about this for a moment. Then he reached into the basket and put one gentle nichin against Nell's cheek, and the baby stirred and made a small protesting sound and went back to sleep. She slept through the whole thing, Toby announced, with the fond exasperation of an older brother who has just survived something significant and wants some acknowledgement of that from someone who was awake for it. Mara laughed. It came out slightly ragged at the edges. The laughter of someone whose body had been holding a great deal of tension and was now releasing it in the only socially acceptable direction. She put her hand over her mouth. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the surface and just sat for a moment. Silas looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything, but there was a whole conversation in it anyway. An accounting of the last several weeks, the canyon shortcut and the land court clerk and the badge on the desk and the cold ride home and all of it laid out silently between them in about 4 seconds, and understood. Jonas Pike arrived at 11:40 with 2 deputies and the warrants. He came to the Whitlock door first, read the situation in Silas's face before Silas said a word, and said he already came. Came and went, Silas said. Good, Pike said. Easier this way. He turned to his deputies. We'll pick him up at the north property. Should be straightforward now that he knows what's filed. He looked at Mara. He had the look of a man who'd seen a great many things in his career, and still found some outcomes worth acknowledging. Mrs. Whitlock. I'm sorry this came to your door tonight. It didn't get through the door, Mara said. Pike glanced at Silas. His expression did the thing it had done. At the office old information, current evidence, something shifting in the column. He nodded once. Then he and his deputies rode north. Voss was taken into custody that night at his property without significant incident, which was how Pike later described it in his report to the territorial inspector. What that description covered was 4 men who had been hired for intimidation, discovering that intimidation had a defined legal consequence and declining to test it, and Gideon Voss himself, faced with the weight of what 3 county families had documented against him, making the practical calculation that resistance was finished. He wasn't a man who fought losing battles. That was, in its own way, the truest thing about him. The territorial inspector arrived 11 days later, not 3 weeks. Pike's for expedited arrival had been granted once the preliminary criminal complaint crossed the right desk in Cheyenne. He spent 4 days in Coldwater Ridge reviewing documents, taking additional statements, and following a paper trail that turned out to extend considerably further than the 4 properties in the immediate valley. Voss had been working the same scheme in 2 other counties for 18 months before he arrived in Coldwater Ridge. 7 families total. 4 had signed. Of those 4, 2 had already lost their land by the time the investigation caught up to the full picture. There was nothing to be done for those 2 families. That fact sat in the room whenever Pike discussed the case, a weight no one could lift, the cost of isolation and silence, and the particular human tendency to believe that what's happening to you is only happening to you. The formal charges against Voss included fraud, falsification of territorial land records, coercion, and 1 count of arson for the Pettigrew barn fire, which a second investigation was now able to connect to a man in Voss's employ through a purchase of accelerant 2 days before the fire and a conversation overheard at a feed store in the next county. Not airtight, Pike said, but enough. Gideon Voss's company collapsed within a month of his arrest, when the investors behind the railroad proposition had discovered that the land claims Voss had been promising them were either contested, fraudulent, or not his to promise. The railroad ultimately purchased only the narrow legal right-of-way it required through the Whitlock North acreage as it happened, which meant a payment to Mara that was modest by some measures and significant by hers. She invested it in livestock, seed, and the barn roof that had needed replacing since October. She did not leave. There was a community supper in Coldwater Ridge on the first Saturday after the warrants were served, not formally organized, just people who'd heard what happened showing up at the same place, at the same time with food, which is how the most important gatherings in small communities usually work. Mara sat at a table with Harlan Marsh and his wife, who had made it out of the house for the first time in 6 weeks, and Ed Cooley, who had brought his daughter from Laramie and was introducing to people with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a man who'd spent too long being alone and was adjusting to being something else. Silas came. That was itself a thing worth noting. He came in, he sat down, he ate supper and talked to Pike and nodded at the people who nodded at him, and he did not position himself at the edge of the room. Caleb sat beside him. Not because anyone arranged it that way, just because Caleb arrived and that was where he sat, and Silas moved his coat off the chair without being asked. Most of its windows were dark. Toby sat across from both of them and spent the meal explaining his updated naming system for the livestock on both properties, which had become considerably more sophisticated since the original map he'd drawn in the first days of the blizzard. Silas listened to all of it. He didn't look like a man tolerating something. He looked like a man who had decided that the particular sound of Toby explaining something was a sound he didn't mind. Mara watched this from a few seats down and felt something that she'd been feeling for several weeks in small doses, a warmth that was not uncomplicated, that came with its own grief underneath it, because anything that felt like a new beginning was also a reminder of what had ended. She didn't try to separate those things. She'd learned in the last months that you don't get the warmth without the grief underneath it, and that's not a flaw. It's just the structure of how love moves through a life. You lose something, you carry it, and eventually you find that you can carry something new at the same time without either one being a betrayal of the other. That's not a thing anyone tells you. You just arrive at it, one ordinary morning without warning. After supper, when people were drifting toward their coats and their horses and the cold ride home, Mara found herself standing with Silas outside the hall door, the night air coming in sharp around them, their breath visible in the lamplight spilling out from inside. Toby and Caleb were helping carry things out from the kitchen. Nell was in the sling across Mara's chest, awake, looking at the night sky with the grave attention she brought to everything. "I need to ask you something," Mara said. He looked at her. "All right. I asked you this once before, partway. I didn't ask the whole thing." He waited. "Do you want to keep living the way you've been living?" she asked. "One chair, one plate, 8 years of making yourself smaller so nothing you do can reach anyone." She said it without accusation. Just the same directness she brought to everything, the directness that had initially unsettled him and that he now understood was not hardness, but the opposite of it, the honesty of a person who respects you enough to say the true thing. Because that's a choice, and it's yours to make. But I think you stopped making it deliberately about 3 weeks ago, and I want to know if you noticed. He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. "I noticed," he said. "Then what are you going to do about it?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Behind them, through the door, the sounds of people packing up, a conversation, Toby's voice raised in some explanation or other, Caleb's lower voice responding. The ordinary sounds of people who have been through something together and come out the other side still standing. Silas looked at Nell, who had turned her head and was regarding him with her standard expression of calm, assessing interest, the one she'd been directing at him since the blizzard. He'd stopped being able to look at her without feeling something specific, not soft exactly, but open, in the way a window is open, useful, and a little dangerous depending on the weather. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. He meant the whole thing, the people, the noise, the weight of being needed, the risk of it. "I spent 8 years making sure I didn't." "I know," Mara said. "I'm not asking you to do it well. I'm asking you to do it." He looked at her. She was standing in the lamplight with a 6-week-old baby in a sling and flour that she'd missed on her coat sleeve from this morning's baking, and her hair doing what it always did by the end of a long day, which was mostly what it wanted rather than what she'd intended. She was not a simple woman. She was not an easy situation. She came with 3 children and a property that had just survived a land fraud scheme and a grief she was still in the middle of and a directness that occasionally felt like being examined by someone who could tell the difference between what you said and what you meant. He had no idea, standing there, whether he was capable of what she was describing. He also understood, standing there, that not knowing whether you're capable of something is not a reason to not try. That had been the mistake the 8 years of it. Not the solitude itself, but the belief that the solitude was protection, when really it was just absence. Absence dressed up as caution. Caleb had named it correctly, and Silas had known it was correct when the boy said it and had been living with that knowledge ever since. "I'll need time," he said. "I have time," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Mara. He said her name the way he'd started saying it in the last weeks, not careful about it anymore. Just her name. Direct. "I'm going to get things wrong." "I know," she said. "So will I." "That's not the question." "What's the question?" She looked at him steadily. "The question is whether you want another winter alone or whether you're done with that." He was quiet for a moment. The cold was serious now, the deep cold of a Wyoming night in late winter, and somewhere north the snow that had been threatening all week was probably going to arrive by morning. "I'm done with that," he said. She nodded. Not triumphant, not relieved just receiving the information, the way she received most information, as something to be worked with rather than celebrated. She was a practical woman. That was one of the things he'd come to understand about her. The warmth was real and the directness was real, and underneath both of them was a practicality that would not let her romanticize any situation, including this one. He respected that more than he could say. Toby burst through the door behind them, coat half on, with the expression of a child who has been inside for what feels like a very long time and requires air. "Are we going?" he asked. "Yes," Mara said. "Can Silas come for breakfast tomorrow?" "Yes," Silas said, to Toby. But he was looking at her. Toby disappeared back inside to collect Caleb, which he did by yelling Caleb's name at a volume that carried clearly through the door and possibly to the next property. Mara almost smiled. 6 o'clock, she said. "I make oatmeal." "I'll be there," he said. She went inside to get the boys organized. Silas stood outside for a moment longer, looking up at the sky. Stars were being covered from the northwest, one by one. The new weather, coming in the same direction from the blizzard had come from weeks ago. He thought about the night he'd ridden into that storm. He told himself it was just the right thing to do. Children might freeze. You ride. It's a simple calculation. And that was true, as far as it went. But it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that he'd been sitting in his house listening to the wind, and he'd thought about those children on the road, and something in him had moved that hadn't moved in a long time, some old instinct that his 8 years of careful solitude hadn't fully succeeded in burying. He'd ridden into the storm because he was still, under everything, the man who rode toward trouble rather than away from it. He'd just forgotten that was who he was. You don't undo what you are by removing yourself from situations that require it. You just deprive yourself of the evidence. He went back inside. In the weeks that followed, things changed in Coldwater Ridge in the particular way that small communities change after a shared crisis, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small adjustments that eventually add up to something different than what was there before. Most of its windows were dark. Families who'd been staying behind their own fence lines started showing up at each other's properties. Ed Cooley helped Harlan Marsh with a fence repair that would have taken Marsh a week alone and took them 2 days together. The Pettigrew widow, who'd lost her property before anyone knew to look at the full picture, was given the use of a small house on the Cooley land, at a rent that was technically a number but practically a gesture, because Cooley had a daughter in Laramie and didn't need the house and understood what it was to be alone in the middle of something too large for one person. Silas showed up at the Whitlock property for breakfast on the first morning and then the next, and eventually it stopped being a thing that required showing up because the structure of being there had become the default. He fixed the north fence line and built a proper chicken coop to replace the one that had been deteriorating since Jonas died, and he taught Caleb carpentry the way his own father had never taught him slowly, correctly, with the patience of a man who has come to understand that the point is the teaching and not the speed of the learning. Caleb learned fast, he always had. But he stopped learning with the urgency of someone trying to make up for lost time and started learning with the attention of someone who believed there would be enough time. That shift was quiet and took about 6 weeks, and Mara saw it happening and said nothing about it to anyone because some things announced themselves better by just being allowed to be. Toby named every animal on both properties as threatened. Silas objected to approximately half the names on the grounds that they were undignified for working cattle, and Toby explained patiently that dignity was a human concept that cows did not hold, and they reached a compromise that neither of them entirely respected in practice. Nell grew. She did it in the sudden, surprising way that infants grow unchanged for 2 weeks, and then visibly different, the face filling out, the eyes sharpening into a particular person, rather than just any baby, the small hands opening and closing with increasingly intentional purpose. Why? She'd had Jonas's eyes from the beginning, that specific gray that was almost green in certain light, and she had something in her expression that was harder to name, a watchfulness, a steadiness, the look of a person who is going to take her time about things and not apologize for it. Silas carried her sometimes. The first time was accidental. Mara had her hands in the dishwater, and Nell had woken up fussing, and Silas was nearest, and it simply happened. The way things happen when people are living close enough together that proximity makes its decisions. He held her with the careful, slightly alarmed competence of a man who has not held an infant in a very long time and is aware that the stakes of getting it wrong are significant. Nell looked up at him. He looked down at her. Some mutual assessment occurred. She stopped fussing. After that, it was less accidental. Mara never made anything of it. She had a talent for not making things of things, for letting the evidence accumulate without narrating it, which was both a form of respect and a form of wisdom, about how men like Silas came to decisions slowly, through action rather than conversation, by doing the thing before they'd fully decided to do the thing. He would not have done well with a woman who needed to discuss every step. She would not have done well with a man who needed her to need that. They had arrived, without planning it, at exactly the right kind of difficult, which is the only kind of love that lasts. By the time spring came properly to the valley, the snow going back up the mountains rather than down, the creek running high and loud, the fields showing the first green underneath the brown Silas, had moved his extra chair to the Whitlock kitchen. Not dramatically. He'd just brought it one morning because the one they had wasn't enough for 5 people, and it was practical. He still had his own property. He still slept in his own house. These things were true, and both of them understood they were details to be worked out in time, rather than problems to be solved immediately, because neither of them was in a hurry, in the way that people are in a hurry when they're not sure the thing is going to hold. They were in the more comfortable position of people who've already seen what holds under pressure and have some basis for trusting it. The badge stayed in his coat pocket for a while. He didn't pin it every day, only when Pike needed him, which was occasional but not infrequent, the Valley having discovered that having Silas Rourke available and willing was a resource worth using. He didn't take the job formally. That wasn't the right shape for it, and Pike understood that without needing it explained. What Silas was, specifically, was the man you called when someone needed help, and the regular channels were too slow, or too far, or too complicated. He'd organized his life around not being that person for 8 years. He found, being it again, that it fit better than the alternative ever had. The alternative had felt like safety, and had actually been a very long, very quiet kind of diminishment. He put the old badge, his original badge, the one he'd buried 8 years ago, in a wooden box. He didn't hide the box. He set it on the mantel of the Whitlock kitchen beside the wool scarf that had carried Nell through the blizzard, the scarf that had been Jonas's and was now just the scarf, the thing that had done what it was asked to do on the worst night of the winter. Caleb saw him put it there. He came and looked at the box without touching it. "Is that from before?" he asked. "Yes," Silas said. Caleb looked at it for a moment. "Are you going to leave it there?" "Yes," Silas said. Caleb nodded slowly. He looked at the scarf beside it. He looked at the box. He was 12 now. His birthday had come and gone in March, with a quiet dinner and a knife Silas had made for him from a piece of steel he'd been saving, with a handle shaped to fit a boy's hand but sized to grow with him. Caleb had held it and looked at it, and not said a word for about 30 seconds, which from Caleb was a significant expression of feeling. "Mama said Papa would have liked you," Caleb said. He was still looking at the box. Silas was quiet for a moment. He felt the weight of that, not uncomfortable, not something to deflect. Just of its windows were dark. Just the weight of being seen clearly by someone who loved Jonas Whitlock and was offering something with that comparison that couldn't be repaid, only honored. "I think I would have liked him," Silas said. Caleb nodded. He went back to whatever he'd been doing. There was a community supper That harvest season where Mara stood up and spoke in front of 40-some people about what had happened with Voss and what it had shown her, not just about predatory men with fraudulent documents, but about what isolation costs a community, about the specific way that Voss had depended on each family feeling alone in their trouble, about what became possible when that isolation ended. She was not a natural public speaker. She gripped the edge of the table she was standing behind, and her voice was not entirely steady at the beginning, and she lost her place once and had to find it again. None of that mattered. She said true things in plain language, and the room listened the way rooms listen when they recognize themselves in what they're hearing. Silas stood at the back of the room. He did not stand at the edge. Susans, he listened to her voice find its steadiness as she went, and he watched the room respond to her. And he felt something that he'd spent 8 years constructing an elaborate architecture to prevent himself from feeling. He felt like he was somewhere he was supposed to be. That's the thing about belonging. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It arrives quietly, in ordinary rooms, in the middle of other things, and you recognize it only when you stop expecting it to feel like something more dramatic than it does. It just feels like this is right. This is where I am. This is the life I'm in. He'd lost a lot of years to the belief that he didn't deserve that feeling. He was done losing years to it. Later that evening, Mara found him by the horses, and they walked back to the ranch together in the early dark, the boys ahead of them, Toby running and Caleb walking with the particular gait he'd had since March, still purposeful but without the tightness that had been in it since October. Silas carried Nell in the crook of his arm, the baby wrapped against the chill, her eyes open and tracking the movement of the lantern light. She likes the dark, Mara said. She's not afraid of much, Silas said. She gets that from her father, Mara said. And maybe a little from the man who carried her out of a blizzard. He looked at her. She was looking ahead, at the boys, at the lane coming toward them out of the dark, and there was something in her profile in the lantern light that he knew he was going to remember, not because it was beautiful, in the way people perform beauty, but because it was hers, specifically, the face of a woman who'd lost the steadiest man she knew and found a way to be her own steadiness and was now, carefully and without rushing, making room for something else alongside the grief. The house came into view, lamp burning in the kitchen window, the new chicken coop, solid and square beside the barn, the north fence line holding where it had been repaired. Porch light was on. Silas had fixed the hinge on the door 3 weeks ago, and it no longer dragged, so it opened cleanly when Caleb pushed it, and the warmth and the light and the smell of the supper that was waiting came out all at once into the night. Toby ran inside. Caleb followed. Mara stopped at the door and looked at Silas. He looked back at her. He thought about the night he'd ridden into the storm. The specific moment he'd made the decision, not even a real decision, more like a recognition that he was already moving, and the only question was how fast. He'd ridden toward 3 children, a woman he didn't know, because something in him had not, in the end, been willing to stay still. That willingness was still there. It had just needed the right weather to come back out. He went inside. The door closed behind him. The Wyoming night settled around the house, cold and deep and enormous the way Wyoming nights are, and inside's house there was light, and there was noise, and there was a baby being handed around, and 2 boys arguing about something at the table, and a woman laughing from the kitchen, and none of it simple, and none of it was finished, and all of it was, in the only sense that actually matters, alive. And the man who had spent 8 years making himself smaller, who had eaten alone and slept alone and organized his entire existence around the belief that love was a thing he'd lost the right. To that man sat down at a table that had 1 too few chairs and 1 too many opinions and a 7-year-old asking him what he thought cows dreamed about, and he answered the question. He answered all of them.